Good morning, and welcome to the California ISO Board of Governors meeting. Before we begin, please ensure you have opened the WebEx chat panel by using the associated icon on the bottom right corner of your screen. Please note that all audio connections are muted until the public comment portion of the conference. For optimal viewing, we recommend leaving the default stack view. All videos will be visible above the whiteboard, and you may scroll through using the page arrows to the left and right of the video strip. To hide non-video participants, you may select Hide Participants with Video Off from the View menu. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. With that, I will turn the conference over to Roger Collington. Please go ahead.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody, and welcome to the California ISO Board of Governors General Session this morning. And let me start out with our roll call, and then I will turn it over to our chair. Chair Galitova, I think you're on mute, but I saw you say here.
I said present, but I am here.
I'm not a lip reader. Vice Chair Bagua.
Present.
Governor Borenstein.
Good morning.
Good morning, sir. Governor Leslie.
Here.
And Governor Shorey.
Here.
Thank you, governors. And we are all present, and we have a quorum. And so let me turn it over to you, Chair Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. And before we get started, you probably noticed that we're all wearing colorful Hawaii shirts, and I even have a lei-on. And I'd like Governor Borenstein to give you the rationale as to why that's happening.
Thank you, Chair Galitova. As we all know, we will be talking today and have been talking about the difficult summer we're likely to face ahead with warming temperatures and a tight supply-demand balance in the California and the Western grid. What people often don't focus on is that on a typical summer day in California, the CAISO runs around 30 gigawatts peak. And on a really hot summer day, they run around 45 gigawatts. That 50% increase is almost all air conditioning. So when we start to think about what can we do in our houses, in our businesses to help get through the summer, the single biggest thing we can do is adjust air conditioning. So we here at the CAISO board, and I'm happy to say also the CAISO the Board of Governors and the
Governing
body have all committed to address this in part by dressing lightly, as you can see we're doing today, and turning up the air conditioning setting a few degrees. And so we want to encourage everyone to think about that and to think about making a contribution by maybe not dressing so formally, dropping the suits and ties, and living in a slightly warmer temperature. I will just point out that this is what Japan did in the summer of 2011 after the Fukushima crisis, and they got through a summer that looked like they were going to be in real trouble by changing air conditioning settings substantially and declaring a Hawaiian shirt summer. So we hope you'll join us. And we're setting the example today, partially at the challenge of the governing body, which did it at their last meeting, and we intend to continue it. Thanks, Chair Galitova.
Thank you so much. Yes, energy conservation is important. Lowering, setting your air conditioner at a higher temperature or not using it at all, if you can, and just using fans is going to help and go a long way. Okay, we're starting with our official agenda now. Do we have at this time any public comment not related to items on the agenda?
As we move to public comment, you may enter the queue by using the WebEx raise hand icon or dialing #2 on your phone. You will hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and affiliation before continuing with your remarks.
It looks like there's no public comment at this time. Moving on to our next.
To myself asking for 3 minutes for item 10.
Who was that? I'm sorry.
Mark Smith from Calpine.
Okay.
And I've noted that, and we do have public comment that we will be doing for item number 10.
Yes. There's public comment for most of the items, and we will open it for public comment at the end as well, just in case we miss somebody.
Excellent.
Okay. Decision on general session minutes. Roger?
Great. Thank you, Angelina. Need a motion to approve the general session minutes from May 20th, 2021. Someone?
So moved.
Second.
Severin, and I think Mary got second on that. Let me go ahead and, as I say every time, but just to be clear, I take each individual vote since we are doing this virtually, and just to make sure we're clear on the votes. I'm going to do this in an alphabetical order. So Governor Bogwat.
Aye.
Governor Borenstein.
Aye.
Governor Galitova.
Aye.
Governor Leslie.
Aye.
And Governor Shorey.
Aye.
Excellent. Thank you, governors. The motion passes, and turn it back to you, Chair.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Roger. CEO report, Elliot Mainzer.
Thank you very much, Chair Galitva and good governors. Good morning to you and everyone. I would like to highlight a few of the items on my CEO report of July 7th. It's obviously been a very, very intense period the last several weeks, and just going to start out with summer readiness and backstop procurement. We've got some updated information. I think everybody knows that summer heating conditions started actually this spring. The first major outbreak of West-wide heat was back on June 17th. Our first flex alerts, the 17th and 18th, went sort of early into stress grid conditions. And I think, as we all know, just over the last couple of months, conditions on the system with respect to the drought and hydro conditions, gas availability. We've had some supply chain issues. A lot of discussions internally with the state prompted us to issue a backstop procurement order, run a solicitation for additional capacity. In early July, wanted to provide some results of that. We were actually able to secure about 607 megawatts of capacity for the month of July, which is nice just to have a little bit more security. Most of that capacity is actually under RA contracts for August and September, but we were able to lock it up for July as well, all in-state resources. So it's nice to have that available going into the summer, because we know it's going to be a challenging period. I think just last Friday, of course, was really another extraordinary set of events with the loss of the California-Oregon interties for a few days, and very, very hot record-setting temperatures inside California and the desert Southwest. Again, we really saw significant grid stress last Friday evening. I want to just note a couple of things that were just absolutely instrumental in getting us through that. I think some changes that we've put in place since last summer. First of all, just across the board, communication coordination within the state, I think, are just much, much better. I think the heat certainly did not catch us by surprise by any stretch of imagination. We had been notifying consumers of the probability. We got a flex alert out. We're also, honestly, in very close coordination with the governor's office. As we saw the fire breaking out in Oregon, that Boot Lake fire, we knew that the probability of losing the COI was increasing by the minute. We actually got the governor issued the executive proclamation at about, we spoke to them late, about 3:45 in the afternoon on Friday. Shortly thereafter, we lost the COI and a significant D-rate on the DC, putting us really right into the edge. That evening, excellent outreach to the IOUs as we triggered the reliability demand response programs. They did a great job there. We got some additional customer response, and the executive proclamation gave us access to some distributed generation. And probably something really notable and really appreciated, our battery fleet, which is now at about 1,300 megawatts in California. We've added another 1,000 megawatts since last summer, performed absolutely fabulously, really taking that extra energy during the day and re-injecting it right back into the net peak. So For all of us at the ISO, it was a very, it's a very intense focus evening. Our folks in the Control Center did an absolutely fabulous job. We didn't have any additional contingencies as we held the edge there at the bottom of our contingency reserve stack, and were able to ride through the event without any disruption to service. So I think some of the lessons learned from last year clearly paid dividends this year, particularly some additional dispatchable capacity, the communication protocols, and of course we recognize that just staying in touch with all of our partners across the spectrum is just so important as we work through what's likely to be a continuing challenging summer. So we will keep you posted. It does look like it's relatively cool. We are fortunate last evening, the California-Oregon Intertie and the DC came back online. Big thanks to the folks at the Bonneville Power Administration, Portland General, Pacific Corps, of course, the Forest Service and others who made fighting with, of course, saving lives is always priority one and firefighting, but they really did prioritize infrastructure restoration, and it's just great to get that back under control. We will be watching that carefully, though, because that fire is by no means contained at this point. So I want to switch gears to the topic of load exports, wheel-throughs. Obviously, this has been a really important issue for all of us in the West, and we received the FERC decision on this in late June, but noted almost immediately that we were turning our attention to the long-term solution. Earlier this week on the 13th, we hosted our kickoff meeting for the initiative to develop a long-term and durable solution to that topic. It was I think, well-attended meeting. I wanted just to, this is an important topic for me personally, and I know all of us at the ISO, because, we really are very, very interested in working as constructively and collaboratively with all of our partners across the West. Of course, California load service is very important, but maintaining reliability for all of us is key. And I wanted just to take a moment, just because of the visibility of this issue, just to share with you a portion of a statement that I offered on the kickoff meeting earlier this week, and that was echoed by President Batcher, who I really appreciated. President of California Public Utilities Commission joined me at that meeting to offer some similar comments. And the statement is as such, while we have a framework in place starting this summer that introduces interim scheduling priorities for wheel-throughs and exports in relation to ISO load as a way to provide access to our system in these stress conditions, we recognize the limitations of this interim framework and are committed to working collaboratively to develop a long-term, durable framework that can more effectively meet the needs of California load-serving entities, as well as others who depend on our transmission system to meet their reliability requirements. The principles of native load protection and open, non-discriminatory transmission service acknowledged by FERC in its recent decision on our interim solution are important guides to this conversation. To those, I would add the principle of looking out for your neighbor. All of us are woven together and dependent on each other to maintain the reliability of the Western interconnection during these times of profound change. Never was this more acutely demonstrated than over the last 5 days. And only by demonstrating a true spirit of collaboration and creative problem solving will we effectively address this important set of issues and the other topics of market design that it impacts. So just wanted to share that with you, just make sure everybody had visibility. It's really important that we work together to solve this problem. Our issues here inside the state are very, very important to all of us, and our partners in adjacent states are grappling with many of the same issues, and reliability is also of profound importance to them. So we need to figure out a solution here that addresses everybody's needs. And thanks again to Maribel and to everybody that showed up and I think had a very constructive conversation. Just a couple other things so we can keep moving. On the transmission planning front, I think all of you governors and others recognize this is just such an important topic at the moment. With the California Public Utility Commission's recent procurement order of 11,500 megawatts of clean energy resources here in the next several years, and the ongoing work that's happening through the California Energy Commission on SB 100 planning, we really have become absolutely laser focused on taking the necessary steps to make sure that there's sufficient transmission, network upgrades, and substation infrastructure to provide deliverability for those resources, particularly into load pockets where we're going to be reducing our dependence on natural gas and just making sure we get these resources on the grid as expeditiously as possible. This is really rising to the very, very top of our priority list in terms of focus. Neil Millar and his team are doing a great job. We will be working very closely with PG&E and Edison and San Diego Gas and Electric and other load-serving entities just to make sure we're really targeting the most important upgrades and getting these resources onto the grid as expeditiously as possible. We're also continue to be very engaged through the WIRED effort that is ongoing under the leadership of the Center for a New Energy Economy. Former Governor Ritter is helping us with that through the Western Electric Industry Leaders Group. This is a very, very critical period with all the attention on transmission. For the Biden administration, potential for a bipartisan infrastructure bill. There is real opportunity here for California and other states to try to diversify our renewable resource fleet through transmission expansion, and also to really increase the interconnectivity of the Western grid to increase the value on both an economic and environmental side of our growing and evolving regional electricity market. So to that end, I'm very excited and look forward to hearing from Therese Hampton here shortly about the upcoming release of the final proposal for the Governance Review Committee. Just real hats off to Therese and all the members of the GRC for their tremendous work. Really appreciate the engagement of parties inside California to really lean in, listen, provide fabulous input on that. Certainly hoping to see the final proposal and see that getting voted out of the GRC. That, of course, will be coming to the board for decision in August. This is a critical milestone, and just again appreciate all the energy that's gone back. And well, it's great to see all of you virtually today again in your Hawaiian shirts, and I'm with you in spirit, mine as well. We're all really looking forward to seeing everybody in person. The ISO is going to be slowly moving people back into back to our work, into our building beginning October 4th. Of course, we have to keep a close eye on it. This Delta variant is still a pretty spooky thing, but at the end of the day, we're excited to start getting back to some sense of normalcy and working to it, moving to a new world of what will be hybrid work for the California ISO staff. So thanks for the opportunity to provide the update. Appreciate everybody's partnership and support, and I will turn it back to you, Chair Galitva.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elliot. That was a terrific report. We did come a little too close to comfort with losing Coy, so I'm happy to hear that Bonneville has taken care of that issue and everything is back online, but it is still razor sharp and too close for comfort. And thank you to CPUC President Maribel Batcher for her words. Yes, we do need a permanent solution, one that fosters collaboration. We're all interconnected and we're in it together. Any questions from the board for our CEO? Okay, moving on to the report from the new governing body chair, Anita Decker. Thank you and welcome, Anita.
Thank you. I'm going to report back that you guys all rose to the challenge with your Hawaiian shirts, so well done. We'll enjoy that. So good morning, Chair Galitva and the governors. So I am speaking today on behalf of the Western EIM governing body, and on our meeting, June 30th, I was selected as chair, and Rob Kondazioka will be the vice chair for this next year. So in our general session, Therese Hampton from the Public Generating Pool and chair of the Governance Review Committee, she updated us on where they're at on part 2 and the recommendations for the joint authority, which I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about. Oregon PUC Commissioner Letha Tawney, chair of the body of state regulators, updated us on the BOSSR activities, including the moderated session by Commissioner Tawney and EIM governing body past chair John Prescott seeking comments on the GRC Part 2 draft on joint authority. And I think many of you listened in on that call. Pam Sporberg with Portland General, the chair of the Regional Issues Forum, gave us a report on the recent RIF meeting and the new EIM participants. The governing body then heard management's presentation on the aggregated capability for co-located resources, including hearing from the DMM and stakeholders. This is number 8 on your agenda today, and in our advisory capacity, the Board of Governors of the EIM governing body unanimously supports management's proposal. Turning to a lot of work that's been done, the EIM governing body then looked at the implementation for the language for Part 1 of the Governance Review Committee's recommendations regarding changes to the charter for the EIM governance and changes to the selection policy for the EIM governing body. And this is also discussed in Roger Collinton's memo dated June 23rd, and it's item number 7 on your agenda, so I think that's coming right up. The EIM, again in its advisory capacity to the Board of Governors, unanimously support the changes in language as presented, including changes to the role of the public interest group and consumer advocates to voting members of the selection committee, expanding the diversity attributes for prospective nominees, allowing for the 60-day holdover period for members whose term is expiring, providing the EIM governing body with joint authority for selection of members of the MSC, including a member of the EIM governing body as a non-voting member on the DMM Oversight Committee, excluding specific confidential areas, removing the limitations on the Regional Issues Forum on offering comments on ongoing stakeholder issues, and authorizing the EIM governing body to retain a market expert consistent with the governing body's mission. The EIM governing body appreciates the opportunity to convey our support for these recommendations, and I believe personally that these recommendations strengthen not only the Western energy imbalance market, but are positive signals for the EIM participants and those considering joining the EIM of the collaboration and commitment to a broader Western market. In regard to open positions on our board, so I'm happy to announce that Rob Kondizioka has been reappointed for his first full 3-year term, and that the Jennifer Gardner was selected for her first 3-year term. And Jennifer replaces long-term member Carl Linville, who we are all going to miss. In our session, we sent Carl off with a resolution really noting his significant contributions to the work of the EIM over his entire term. And we know he's off the board, but we don't expect to miss him, so he'll show up in stakeholder areas, I'm sure. The EIM governing body received an update report from staff on the recent EIM participants' status. All of the incoming entities transitions went well, and while there was a pause for Northwestern Energy, they did come in mid-June, and so we're excited that there are 15 participants, and we've expanded the footprint into Montana. We heard from staff regarding the 2021 policy initiatives, which is also on your agenda. We also had a follow-up report from the DMM. We had asked for some information on the resource sufficiency testing from the August 2020 heat wave, and I want to say that Eric Hildebrand did a great job bringing that back and giving us quite a bit of additional information. We had a report on the market performance, and lastly, we are looking at logistics and legal requirements in terms of engaging a governing body market expert, and I'll have more on that on a future update. This concludes my report, and I'm happy to respond to any questions.
Thank you so much, Chair Decker. Any questions from the board? At this time, no. Thank you again, and congratulations to Rob Kondizioka for being reappointed. And yes, we will miss Carl Linville. He was a good board member and a good friend, but, welcome Jennifer Gardner. She is a fabulous addition to the governing body, and as I have worked with her as part of the GRC, and she will be a very valuable member. So onwards and upwards, and thank you very much for the briefing. Glad to hear that DMM is helping and that they're providing input and you're utilizing their incredible resources. They are a resource for you for information and analysis, and we're happy that you're taking advantage of that. Moving on to our next agenda. We have the EIM Governance Review Committee Chair, Therese Hampton, with the latest update. Thank you for coming, Therese, and again, congratulations on the wonderful work that the GRC has been doing under your leadership.
Thank you, Chair Galitva, and to the governors this morning. Thanks for the opportunity to give an update. I want to share with you a little bit of what we've done over the last couple of months and where we think we're headed by the end of this month. So as you know, we've done the governance recommendations in 2 parts, and we've been focused on the delegation of authority, joint authority model in this part 2. And since the time that we put forward part 1, we did some one-on-one outreach with different stakeholders that submitted comments on the delegation of authority. On May 12th, we published a straw proposal for how to scope joint authority and how to manage dispute resolution. And on May 20th, we held a workshop and talked to different stakeholders and kind of gathered their input on that straw proposal. We took written comments through June 11th, and then as Chair Decker had mentioned, the Western Interstate Energy Board hosted a workshop as well to go through some of the different stakeholder perspectives. And it was nice because it actually happened after people had submitted their written comments. So it was an opportunity to actually do a little bit of Q&A on those written comments and some of the ideas that came in on the written comments. At this point, the GRC really feels like we've had some good, robust discussion on these issues and feel like we have sufficient stakeholder input to make recommendations on the topics before us. So we are in process of reviewing a draft final proposal with a target of voting on it by the end of this month. So at that point, a target of having a meeting on July 30th and having a vote on that would then come both to you and to the governing body. So that's where we're at. I'm happy to take any questions if you have them.
Thank you so much, Therese. Any questions for Therese Hampton from the board? Okay, well, thank you so much for all the hard work, and we look forward to the next step. Moving on to item number 6, decision on consent agenda. Roger Collington.
Thank you, Chair Galitova. As the board knows, the consent agenda consists of matters from the EIM governing body that they have approved. And in this case, this is under changes to the EIM governing body charter. And as part of their governance charter, the provision in the charter, I think is section 7 or 8, we've just renumbered it, but calls for changes that affect the sections on the regional issues form or the body of state regulators to go on the consent agenda. So those have been approved by the governing body. And in this case, as part of implementing the GRC's proposal part 1, there are some changes to the RIF section that have been provided, and those again are on the consent agenda. So with that introduction, we have a motion for the Board of Governors to approve the July 15, 2021 consent agenda comprised of changes to provisions in the Charter for Energy and Balanced Market Governance regarding the Regional Issues Forum as set forth in management's memorandum to the EIM governing body dated June 30th, 2021, which has been provided to the board as well. And if I can have a motion for that.
So moved.
Angelina, and second?
Second.
Severin. Governor Bogwart, your vote, please.
Aye.
Governor Borenstein.
Aye.
Governor Galitova.
Aye.
Governor Leslie.
Aye. Aye.
And Governor Shorey.
Aye.
Thank you, governors. The motion passes. And since I have the floor, I might as well just move this right to item number 7, which is related. Item number 7 is seeking the board's approval for the implementation of GRC proposal part 1. Now, you've approved the policy on that recently in your last board meeting, and this item actually implements those changes that come out of that policy and out of approving the GRC proposal required for board approved documents. The EIM governing body charter is a board approved document, the selection policy, as well as the DMM oversight committee charter. And with that, let me first thank Dan Schonkweiler, Peter Calusi, Burton Gross for their tireless effort on this. Of course, everybody on the GRC, and now we have part 2 coming up, and we have Greg Cook and John Anders. So it's really been a great team effort, and I want to acknowledge all of those involved up to now and that have signed up to be involved for the future as well. So we really appreciate that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dan, and he has a presentation, and then we'll walk through the motion. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Roger. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, Roger, good morning, Chair Galitova and governors. Roger and Chair Decker of the governing body have already covered a lot of my presentation, so let me try to move through it as quickly as possible without repeating that. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah, as Roger pointed out, you've approved the policy, and now this requires changes to a couple of documents that are board-approved policies, and so that's what we're looking for. Next slide. The governing body, as Chair Decker explained, recommends these changes. Some of the changes you've just approved through your consent agenda, so I'm going to review the remainder of those changes that we'll be asking you to approve. Next slide. In the selection policy, the changes that we're asking you to approve implement making the representative of the public interest and consumer advocate sector a voting member of the nominating committee as opposed to just an advisory member. They emphasize obtaining diverse perspectives and adjust the process for how the nominating committee will seek them. They propose that the nominating committee may ask a sitting member of the governing body to hold over up to 60 days to allow them more time to complete their search, if that makes sense. And there are some cleanup edits, including updated titles for vice presidents. No, go ahead. You're in the right slide. Thank you. On the charter for EIM governance, the changes that are outside what's currently Section 5 or 6, in other words, the changes you haven't already approved through the consent agenda, involve a link up to the 60-day holdover, so that the governing body could implement that if it made sense. A new section on market analysis that talks about provides joint approval for MSC appointments, joint approval of both the board and the governing body. A member of the governing body sitting as a non-voting participant on the DMM Oversight Committee, and the authority of the governing body to retain the governing body market expert. It also adds a provision about reevaluating EIM governance within the next 5 years. Next slide, please. This slide describes the changes that you've already approved about the Regional Issues Forum, but they generally have to do with the Regional Issues Forum being able to discuss and take positions on issues that are in ongoing stakeholder processes. Next slide. There were several, if you tracked through or anyone tracked through the GRC's Part 1 draft final proposal, they'd see a number of changes in the table that we haven't implemented. So to trace those through to the end and explain why. One is delegation of authority, which they're still working on. Another recommendation concerned the governing body's mission, which the recommendation was not to change it. There were recommendations, and the GRC said things about funding for the body of state regulators. That's being taken care of outside the ISO between the body of state regulators and state regulated market participants, so it doesn't require changes. Similar situation for the BOSR meetings and them including representatives of publicly owned utilities and federal power marketing agencies. That's something that the BOSR, which is a self-governing entity, is taking care of. And finally, cost allocation for the expenses associated with the governing body market expert. Those are that's handled through the tariff and doesn't require changes. Next slide, please. There is also, you'll see in the memo, then a tie-in change about to the DMM Oversight Committee charter about welcoming a member of the governing body as a non-voting participant in those meetings, and so that's also a part. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about these proposed changes to the Charter for EIM Governance, the selection policy, or the charter for the DMM Oversight Committee.
So, Dan, I have a question. This is Ash Bhagwat. Not about the changes that are being proposed, but you just said that the cost allocation for the market expert is going to be done through the tariff. Could you explain what that means?
Absolutely. GRC recommended was that the cost of the governing body market expert be allocated to the entire market, in other words, as an overhead cost. And they were specifically responding to proposals that there be a special allocation for the governing body market expert so that the costs would be borne only by EIM participants outside of California. They rejected that. They said this ought to be a standard cost because this is supposed to benefit the entire market the same way that the costs of DMM or the MSC or anybody else, I mean, the same way the costs of the EIM governing body itself were allocated. And so those formulas are already in the tariff, in the GMC and cost allocation related provisions. And so that's what I meant.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ash. Any other questions from the board at this time? Okay, thank you. And I'd like to express my appreciation to Dan Schockweiler, Bert Gross, and especially Peter Colucci for helping with this process and running a very tight ship and having a very fast turnaround of all drafts. Without your help, this would not have gone as smoothly and expeditiously as it has. So thank you. Your hard work is appreciated. The EIM governing body already noted that they have a unanimous support for this item. So at this time, we'll move to public comment.
Just as a reminder to please state your name and affiliation before continuing with your remarks. You may enter the queue by using the WebEx raise hand icon or dialing #2 on your phone. At this time, no one has raised their hand.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are ready for a motion.
Thank you, Chair Glitzva. Move that the Board of Governors approves the proposed revisions to the Charter for EIM governance, the selection policy for the EIM governing body, and the Charter of the DMM Oversight Committee as discussed in and attached to the memorandum dated July 7, 2021. Can I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Thank you, Ash. Second was Mary. Governor Bogwat, your vote, please.
Aye.
Governor Borenstein?
Aye.
Governor Glitzva?
Aye.
Governor Leslie?
Aye.
And Governor Shorey?
Aye.
Excellent. Thank you, Governors. Back to you, Chair Glitzva.
Thank you very much. Moving on to item number 8, decision on aggregate capability constraints for co-located hybrid resources. Greg Cook and Anna McKenna.
Good morning, Chairman Galatova. This is Anna McKenna. Good morning, board members. Today, Greg is going to present to you our proposal on some changes related to the management of hybrid co-located resources. I want to thank Greg and the team for a quick resolution to an issue raised to us by stakeholders on this issue. We hope this addresses many of the issues that have been raised, and Greg will provide us a thorough presentation. Greg?
Thank you, Anna. Good morning, Chair Glitzva and board members. So I'm here to present our proposal on some enhancements to the aggregate capability constraints for co-located hybrid resources. And we're bringing this proposal today based on stakeholder requested enhancements to our hybrid co-located resources model that was supported by the EIM governing body and approved by the board last summer. As a note, this proposal doesn't include new functionality that would be available to the ISO as well as the EIM balancing authority areas. And as EIM governing body Chair Decker noted, this was presented to the EIM governing body at their June 30th meeting, and the EIM governing body, as noted by Chair Decker, did provide support for this proposal under their advisory authority. Next slide, please. So I'll start with a quick review of what was developed last summer. So under the co-located model, there are individual resource IDs for each generator behind a single point of interconnection. So this policy includes what we call an aggregate capability constraint, or ACC for short, which is designed to prevent what we call an oversized co-located generation from exceeding interconnection limits. And, as a simple example, the interconnection limits are generally sized to the maximum output of a solar resource for a hybrid that has a solar resource combined with a battery resource. And so, for example, if you had a 100 megawatt solar resource combined with a 50 megawatt battery, generally we would see that behind a 100 megawatt point of interconnection limit. So then that aggregate capability constraint then is used to manage the market dispatch of that co-located resource to always be within that 100 megawatt point of interconnection limit in that example. I'll also note we are also including some additional functionality that will allow ancillary services to be provided by these resources starting this fall, and this was approved as part of the hybrid phase 2 proposal in the fall of last year. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, stakeholders requested the ISO develop these subordinate aggregate capability constraints for co-located resources. And they really did this to help facilitate contracting by load-serving entities for shares of the co-located resources. So what we're seeing is that developers are contracting with load-serving entity off-takers for fractional shares of not only the resources, but also that interconnection limit. And they really want to have the ability to be able to bid and have the shares settled separately. And we're seeing this as very prevalent for large energy projects with solar and storage at the same location. In fact, I think it's almost, we're seeing it for almost all resources that are greater than 20 megawatts. And we've also seen up to 5 separate off-takers on a single project. So we are proposing new functionality to model those contractual limits. So we do have in place the master aggregate capability constraint that models that point of interconnection limit, which was part of the original proposal. And here we are proposing to add a sub-aggregate capability constraint to model the contractual limits that would represent the shares of the resources. And I have an illustration of this on the next slide. So you can go to the next slide. So in this example, this is a simple 2 off-taker example. So here we have a 350 megawatt co-located resource, 233 megawatt solar resource combined with 117 megawatt battery resource. And then that has been sold into 2 separate shares to 2 separate LSEs. And those shares are represented by these 2 sub-ACC limits. So the first one is at 110 megawatts because that LSE contracted for 110 megawatts of the share of the solar resource, where the second LSE contracted for the remaining 123 megawatts. And then similarly, they've contracted for shares of the battery storage resource as well, where LSE1 contracted for 55 megawatts of the total 117 megawatt battery resource, and LSE2 then contracted for the remaining 62 megawatts. So under this proposal, each of these off-takers are able to bid these resources separately. And, I think, for example, if the LSE1 on the left decided that they wanted to bid their battery storage resource at a price of $25 a megawatt hour, whereas battery LSE2 decided that they wanted to bid theirs at a slightly higher bid price of, say, $30, this would essentially, the market would dispatch LSE1s first and only dispatch LSEs2 once we had exhausted that 55 megawatts. So then if the market were to dispatch more than 55 megawatts, then it would be doing that at the price provided by LSE2. So by putting these sub-ACC limits in place, the proposal does provide for the shares to be bid and settled separately. We can go to the next slide. So we did identify a concern, though, by if we were to implement this policy, because we noted that there can be situations where energy is constrained behind a sub-ACC limit that is needed to support grid reliability when we may be in a situation where there's insufficient supply to meet demand. So in these situations, we're proposing to relax that sub-ACC limit in order to access that energy. And this would be done through the market by setting a relaxation parameter higher than the bid cap, but lower than the master ACC level. So, we have an example of here of how this could happen. So in this situation, for some reason, in this example, LSE2 has bid or scheduled their battery resource in a way that they have exhausted their share of energy under that battery resource. But on the other hand, LSE2 still has a fair amount of energy available from LSE1, still has significant energy available from their share. So the problem is, in this scenario, when you still have a significant amount of solar being produced, so here the solar resources are producing both 75 megawatts, so 150 megawatts out of the total resource, we can see that under that sub-ACC limit on the left that's set at 100 megawatts, we could only get an additional 25 megawatts out of that battery storage resource for LSE1's share, whereas LSE2 has no more to provide from the battery, so they could only provide their 75 megawatts from the solar. So the maximum we could get out if we were not to relax those constraints, that sub-ACC constraint on the left, would be 175 megawatts, which is under that master ACC limit. However, if we were, again, in this reliability situation where we were short on supply, we could relax that sub-ACC limit on the left and get an additional 25 megawatts out of the battery storage resource, and thereby getting the full 200 megawatts out of that hybrid resource. So, a few points I will make on this. This was the area of the proposal that I think provided the most concerns from stakeholder perspectives. We've had significant discussions with LSA and others about these concerns, and I want to reiterate, this proposal does not limit an off-taker's ability to use their contracted capacity, since the ACC parameter is set at a level higher than the bid cap. That sub-ACC is only relaxed when the market has exhausted all the economic bids and there's insufficient supply to meet demand. This also does not allow one off-taker to use capacity contracted to another. And then as a final point, I'd like to make is that we believe it is appropriate to have a much higher relaxation parameter on that master ACC limit, which protects from overloading transmission facilities, versus the sub-ACC constraints, which are simply protecting those contractual limits. So if we go to the next slide, please. And so given this concern, we are proposing functionality that would enable us to access that available energy under emergency scenarios. And what I mean by those emergency scenarios is that we have reliability conditions when there's insufficient supply bids to meet demands. And so we have a couple of provisions that are related to reliability here. First, even though the market software enforces the fixed master aggregate capability constraints, we do have procedures in place to temporarily reevaluate those point of interconnection constraints under emergency scenarios, and we would, the sub-AC constraints, we would have the ability to be reevaluated using that same manual process. And then next, as I discussed on that previous slide, the ISO market software can relax the sub-ACC constraints when the market software cannot find sufficient supply to match demand, and we can relax those modeled contractual limits. And again, this would only occur when we have run out of effective economic bids, which is essentially the same circumstance under which we would conduct manual interventions to deal with emergency type situations. And finally, these situations can develop relatively quickly, so we don't believe that the ISO should have to declare an emergency to access this energy, which some stakeholders advocated for us to do. So next slide, please. So in conclusion, we request that the board approve the proposed enhancements to the co-located resource model. We believe it provides the benefits of adding that sub-capability constraint will help facilitate the contracts for fractional shares of these hybrid resources. And the proposal also includes those provisions so that we can access that available energy under the emergency conditions to support reliable grid operations. And as a final point I wanted to make, we're currently planning to implement this in phases. So we would have the initial sub-ACC limits relaxation parameters set at the same level as the master ACC parameters in the fall of this year. And then next spring, we would then add the lower relaxation parameter to the sub-ACC limits in the spring of next year. And we believe this also provides us the opportunity to observe how this is functioning prior to implementing those lower sub-ACC limits prior to next summer. So with that, I would be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Greg Cook from the board? And I'd also like to note that the governing body gave a unanimous consent for this item as well. And at this time, we'll open it to public comment. Oh, no, Department of Market Monitoring comments. Ryan Kurlinski.
Hey, good morning. This is Ryan Kurlinski from the Department of Market Monitoring. Thank you, Chair Galitova and Board of Governors, for the opportunity to provide DMM's views on the ISO's aggregate capability constraint proposal. DMM supports the ISO's proposal to create sub-constraints under that master point of interconnection constraint. DMM also supports the proposal to potentially relax these new sub-constraints in conditions when there is a regional supply shortage. Enforcing the new sub-constraints is intended to help model one physical set of co-located resources as if it were multiple sets of co-located resources. And this is to accommodate contractual provisions that split the output of one physical set of resources between several off-takers. Yeah, so some stakeholders wanted the ISO to enforce the sub-constraints at all times, but enforcing the sub-constraints at all, whether or not there is a regional supply shortage, could result in some less efficient use of the actual resources split behind the multiple sub-constraints. So DMM views the ISO's proposal to relax the sub-constraint in some limited situations when it shouldn't impede any off-taker's rights. We view this proposal as a reasonable compromise at this time that should help to get new resources with emerging technologies online. But under this approach, the ISO will be modeling one physical resource as if it is many in order to accommodate the outside contractual provisions. This is something that we'll keep an eye on as it's implemented because the ISO may want to revisit it if it is creating significant inefficiencies in the dispatch. So we support the ISO's proposal today, and I'd be happy to try to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Any questions for Ryan Kurlinski? Okay, then now we can open it to public comment.
Just as a reminder to please state your name and affiliation before providing your remarks. You may enter the queue by using the WebEx raised hand icon or dialing #2 on your phone. Please go ahead.
Hello, this is Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I'm representing the Large Scale Solar Association and the Solar Energy Industries Association today. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I was wondering if we could change to Greg's slide 24, because I'd like to reference that in my comments if that's possible to do. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Anyway, I wanted to say that we did actively participate in the stakeholder process and are generally pleased with the direction of this proposal. We were one of the parties that had a question and a concern about the proposal to relax basically the boundaries between the two between sub ACCs for a particular resource. I do want to point out that when you're talking about dividing up resources, it's not dividing up the output. It actually is a physical separation and metering, and as though it was a separate project of the resources under these two ACC limits. So it's not taking a battery and just splitting the output. They're actually separate battery units, separate solar inverters. They are actually configured as separate projects with their own metering. And where it says that direction, that arrow with the ISO, that's actually basically a shared gen tie. So these projects are basically built as though they were separate projects completely. The only thing that ties them together is that they happen to be under the same generator interconnection agreement. Otherwise, they are constructed physically separately. And in fact, they're constructed exactly the same way as two separate projects sharing a single gen tie, which is a very, very common construct in the CAISO markets. So we had some big concerns about this particular proposal to sort of blur the boundaries between the sub-ACCs. In our opinion, it was as though you were pretty much renting, say, one side of a duplex where, you and the other duplex party had had separate parking for your cars, but you had a common driveway. And the driveway is wide enough for both cars, but somehow your neighbor would have the ability to use your side of the driveway whenever some third party decided that was for an important use of the driveway. So what the CAISO has effectively done, which makes us a lot more comfortable with this proposal, is to say, well, your neighbor's only going to be able to use your driveway when you're not actually going to be using the driveway. So, okay, that's better. And it's been represented that this would be under rare circumstances, although we've not received any data about how often or how frequently and for what periods this might occur. So, the fact is if it's rare and it's only once in a while, well then the fact that you're still paying for your share of the driveway might be okay, even though the other neighbor is using it occasionally. But we are concerned about this, and we're willing to see how it goes in actual practice. It is still discriminatory because if these two sub-ACCs were constructed as separate projects, as smaller projects, then effectively they would not have the ability to use each other's capacity on that gen tie or in that driveway. So it is still discriminatory, but we're willing to see how it works and see if there are any problems that occur. I should point out that, this ability to build large projects are very, very efficient to finance, permit, and build, and the fact that they can be divided into different off-takers is not an arbitrary thing. The procurement market has fragmented significantly in recent years with CCAs and others coming in, and the fact that these projects can be developed efficiently in a larger scale, but then divided among different off-takers is a big efficiency and cost reducer for consumers, excuse me, in the market. So I didn't want to leave the impression after some of the discussion, particularly from DMM, that this is an inefficient thing to do. It actually is a very efficient thing to do. And you can imagine in cluster 14, where the average project size was 200 megawatts, if you'd have 4 times as many applications if you came in with 50 megawatt projects, so that this could happen in a certain way. So anyway, I wanted to leave you with the impression that this is an efficient thing to do. We appreciate the functionality that it will provide. This is the first, by the way, that we have heard about any phased implementation, so we have some concerns about that and would like to hear more about that, but we can address that with the CAISO offline. They've been very good about keeping lines of communication open, and we have really appreciated that as we've gone through the process. So thank you. I'll take any questions if anyone has any about this.
Thank you very much, Susan, for the visual explanation and the driveway narrative. I was just curious, are you concerned that this is going to be a physical and a financial burden in the future potentially as we see how it goes?
Well, I think one of the things that we do not yet know is whether off-takers themselves will be comfortable with this. This is this blurring of the lines between the sub-ACCs is a new feature that came out, and that's why there was so much concern. So if it turns out that it means that off-takers will be hesitant to contract with projects under these terms, then I think that would, of course, cause concern to us. So I think that's the thing that we're worried about, and we will see what happens. If it turns out to be a very frequent occurrence, that may be another thing that will make them reluctant. And of course, if projects can't be contracted, then they're just not viable. So we're going to wait and see. We're going to do our best to help the off-takers understand how this will work and see how it works ourselves.
Well, we'll do our best to alleviate concerns as well. We want to help the market. We certainly see the value in large-scale projects and the economies of scale that they bring in terms of, as you said, more efficient permitting, more efficient contracting, and lower costs. And as we transition to more carbon-free technologies, we have to figure how we can all work together to optimize the system all around and not create any concerns or trepidation. So, Greg, do you want to answer any of the concerns that were raised or take it offline?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would point out, in this example, had we, when we're relaxing that sub-ACC limit on the left, had we not done that, by doing that, I really don't think there's any harm to either one of the off-takers. In fact, I would argue it's probably a benefit to LSE1 because they're now able to sell an additional 25 megawatts that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to sell had we not relaxed that sub-ACC limit. And then there's also no harm to LSE2 here because they'd already, dispatched their share of the resource. So, they didn't have an ability to sell any more energy in any event. So it's not by using that extra capacity on the interconnection limit, I really don't think there's any harm to either of the LSEs, and in fact, there's probably a net benefit because LSE1 is now able to sell more energy, and it would be at a very high price as well because it would be at that administrative price that we use to relax that constraint, which is again above the big cap level.
I think the same. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I think the same. The same could be said for two projects separate projects sharing the same GenTie, and yet they would not be subject to this kind of relaxation. So again, we're going to do our best to understand how it is, see how it works, and help the off-takers understand this. But it is sort of treating projects that are large and then subdivided in a different manner than separate projects, and we're just a little concerned about that. So, but we're going to do our best to work with it and understand, and hope that everyone will find this to be acceptable.
And we'll work with you as well. I'm sure the ISO will always be available.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question of Susan before we lose her, or maybe we did already? No.
I'm still here if you can still hear me.
So you said that these are actually physically separate facilities. Is that always the case?
Yes, I mean, because basically if you're going to be bidding and scheduling resources separately, they're separate resource IDs, meaning they must have separate metering, and those have to be attached to discrete equipment. So you can't take one battery and put 2 meters on it or 2 resource IDs. You actually would have separate batteries, physical batteries and inverters in the separate resource IDs. So they're not sharing a particular piece of equipment, they're separate.
So yeah, so now I see what you mean by discriminatory, that there is this direct parallel to generators sharing GenTie and not subject to this.
That's correct.
It seems like, I mean, the way this is being implemented above the bid cap, it seems like this will just avoid lost opportunities and a inefficient bargaining process that might have to take place in a split second and will benefit. But I guess we'll see.
I guess we'll see. So yeah, that's pretty much our position.
And maybe the 2 generators that share a GenTie actually would like the CAISO to be doing the same thing.
Well, there are generators out there, many generators that do share GenTies, and we have not seen that kind of arrangement between them. So I guess that's all we can really say right now.
Do you have a thought about why not?
I think that it is cleaner, and there's great concern that the boundaries will be blurred whenever DMM comes out and says, well, we're going to keep an eye on this, we may change our mind later. That makes people concerned. So if people have seen it to be cleaner, to simply contract with things separately and not allow each other to impinge on each other. Basically you can't use my part of the driveway, and that's, and even in some cases, many cases, in fact, these are affiliates of the same company, but the off-takers are very clear that they have wanted this to be separate, that sort of their facility should be separate from others, and they don't want to have to worry about other people using what they're paying for. So again, that doesn't mean their attitude can't change or we can't explain it, or if it all seems to work well, that maybe that will be okay. But we just have not seen that kind of ability between off-takers to share their capacity with each other at this point.
Yeah, I guess I would disagree with the word impinge, since the way this is being proposed, it doesn't impinge. It doesn't actually prevent the other off-taker from getting full use of the other facility.
Well, would it be okay for your neighbor to use your driveway if you weren't using it? Maybe once in a while. Or maybe you could use theirs and that would be okay. But
this is Ash Bhagwat. This is only going to be true during an emergency.
No, it's not. In fact, it's before emergencies. Right now, if they were separate projects, you could only do it during a system emergency. What the ISO is proposing to do is to make it as part of a market constraint. It's before you get to an emergency, and maybe it would help prevent an emergency. It's another reason why we're willing to kind of see what happens with this. But it would come out of the market, not during a declaration of a system emergency.
Right, but so, the market is short.
When the market is short, but as part of the market function to relax constraints, that's part of the market optimization. It's not during an emergency, it's before that. And so that's another reason why we were concerned. If the only way that this would happen would be during a system emergency, well then, two projects sharing the same GenTie have that same issue. And the CAISO has broad authority to come in and do that. But this would happen before a system emergency, even though they've used the lower case E. It's during the relaxation of the market constraints during the regular algorithms of the market. It's not during a system emergency, capital S, capital E.
But it's trying to reflect.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I'm just, again, we understand, we understand it, and we're going to try and work with it. So that's all I'm saying. But it is different from if those were two really separate projects, because that cannot be blurred outside of a system emergency. So it's different. That's what we're saying. We'll work with. We'll do our best.
Okay. Thank you so much, Susan. Appreciate your comments. Any other questions? Thank you again. Do we have any other public comments on this item?
We had one other person who's raised their hand.
Hi, my name is Ben Schwartz. I'm the policy manager for the Clean Coalition. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I just want to reiterate what I wrote in written comments, and that is that the Clean Coalition strongly supports this proposal, in part because it increases flexibility for projects both large and small. In our experience, we have a CEC EPIC grant-funded project that's a partnership with PG&E in downtown San Francisco, and it's a front-of-the-meter energy storage system that is going to take service under WDAT. Initially, it was going to have a two energy storage system design that would help increase the hosting capacity of the feeder it was on, and the total energy storage was just a little bit over 1 megawatt hour. And so, initially that was fine, and there was an SGIA signed with PG&E. However, a couple weeks after the SGIA was signed, PG&E responded that the design needed to be changed and a 2BESS system was too large, despite the fact that it would never be operating at full capacity in addition to behind-the-meter solar. And so, what we found is that had there been a software solution such as this allowed, the Clean Coalition would have been able to move forward with a 2BESS system, and it would have saved a lot of time and money. And so where we see one of the most important applications of this is simplifying the front-of-meter interconnection process and actually creating a built-in software approach that reduces the need for expensive physical hardware designs or workarounds that are simply unnecessary. And given the fact that the project that we're developing was or is intended to increase the hosting capacity on the feeder, it would not only be beneficial for the feeder, but it would also be beneficial in cases of emergencies, as was being discussed before. So I appreciate the opportunity to comment, and I strongly urge the adoption of this proposal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. Really appreciate your comments. Those were good points, that our objective of improving efficiencies can actually take place. So thank you. Any questions for Ben from the board? Okay, moving on. Do we have additional public comments?
There are no further questions.
Great. I think we're ready for a motion now.
Thank you, Chair Galitzva. Move that the ISO Board of Governors approves the tariff revisions necessary to enhance the hybrid co-located resources model to include subordinate aggregate capability constraints as described in the memorandum dated July 7, 2021. And move that the ISO Board of Governors authorizes management to make all necessary and appropriate filings with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to implement the proposal, including any filings that implement the overarching initiative policy but contain discrete revisions to incorporate Commission guidance in any initial ruling on the proposed tariff amendment. Have a motion, please.
So moved.
Jan. And I'm sorry, second?
Second.
That was Mary?
Second.
Thank you. Thank you. Governor Bhagwat?
Aye.
Your vote? Governor Borenstein?
Aye.
Governor Galitzva?
Aye.
Governor Leslie?
Aye.
And Governor Shorey?
Aye.
Excellent. Thank you, Governors. The motion passes.
Thank you so much. And moving on to number 9, I also realized that we don't have a break built in whatsoever in the agenda. So if governors are all right, I would propose taking a 5-minute break after this item. Okay. So moving on to number 9, decision on resource adequacy availability assessment mechanism exemption option. Anna McKenna and Greg Cook. Thank you.
Yeah, and Governor Galitzva, let me just interject real quick that we did receive yesterday a public comment letter from California Large Energy Consumers Association on this item, and that has been provided to the board.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Chair Galitzva. Oh, thank you, Roger, and thank you, Chair Galitzva. We are about to present to you another item that we took on an expedited basis to address concerns raised by stakeholders with regards to the treatment of certain demand response resources and our resource adequacy availability assessment mechanism and application of penalties under that structure. Greg Cook, Executive Director of Market Infrastructure and Policy, is going to again present to you the proposal. And with that, I will turn this over to Greg.
Thank you, Anna. So this is our proposal for some changes to how we apply the Resource Adequacy Availability Assessment Mechanism, otherwise known as RAIN, to demand response resources. And, I'll note this is a narrowly scoped proposal, and to address that resource adequacy treatment of, in particular, demand response resources that have that act more as a variable resource. And so this proposal is to try and improve how we treat those resources. Next slide, please. So some recent CPUC decisions have prompted this proposal. First, the CPUC issued a proposed decision in their resource adequacy proceeding, and in that decision they recognized that demand response is a variable resource, and they proposed that the qualifying capacity methodology, which is the capacity evaluation for resource adequacy purposes, would be reevaluated going forward in RA years 2023 and beyond. And in that order, they also said that they would consider an ELCC methodology if the ISO exempted demand response resources from RAIN. ELCC is a fairly well-recognized methodology that measures resources' ability to produce energy when the grid is most likely to experience energy shortfalls. And then next, there was a recent ruling from President Batcher that would allow the ISOs and IOUs to file a new ELCC study for use as qualifying capacity methodology for demand response resources for this upcoming RA year in 2022. So again, these anticipated changes by the CPUC really led us to seek these tariff revisions to treat demand response as RAIN exempt variable output resources. Next slide, please. So what we're proposing is to provide those variable demand response resources with a RAIN exemption option. And quite simply, we're proposing to exempt both PDR and RDRR demand response resources that have their qualifying capacity value assessed using either an ELCC or a similar methodology from the Resource Adequacy Availability Incentive Mechanism. And what we're saying is that the methodology must account for the contribution to reliability as well as the saturation effects of the resource's variable output nature. And in the proposal, we identified two principles that we would be looking towards to assess any potential counting methodology. And those principles included first that methodology must assess the resource's contribution to reliability across all hours of the year or seasons as a variable resource. And then the second principle was to assess the resource's interactive effects with other similarly situated resources. And, the final point here is that demand response resources can continue to use other methodologies that don't align with those principles, like the load impact protocol that's used today, but we believe they should continue to under the ability incentive mechanism like other non-variable resource adequacy resources, which, again, we think this may be appropriate for certain demand response resources that may not be variable in nature. And if that is the case, then, they should be able to provide the amount of capacity that has been shown in their RA showings and, thereby not be assessed to any RAIN type charges. Next slide, please. So we did receive some stakeholder concerns about how these proposed changes would be implemented. I think there was a lot of support, as you'd expect, from the DR community of the RAIN exemption for demand response with variable load reduction capability, but some stakeholders did not agree with our requiring an ELCC or similar approach to qualify for the exemption. And then stakeholders were also concerned with requiring that ELCC-based qualifying capacity methodology as a precondition for the exemption. And in particular, they were concerned that the ISO would have that sole discretion to determine whether the counting methodology aligned with the proposed principles that were laid out. So many stakeholders requested to include a collaborative approach with the local regulatory authority in establishing that acceptable counting methodology for the exemption. So in response to those comments, we did change the proposal and to condition the RAIN exemption on the use of that ELCC or similar methodology, and included new language that the ISO would determine it in conjunction with the relevant local regulatory authority. I will note we did, as Roger noted, we did receive a letter late yesterday from CLECA, and they raised some concerns about that. I think they do not agree with the fact that they should have to have an ELCC or similar methodology for the RAIN exemption. They also raised some concerns with some potential changes to that the PUC is considering on the resource adequacy program. In response to that, I will say, what we're really aiming to do with this proposal is provide clarity on the path for a RAIN exemption for demand response resources. And the way we've structured this proposal, it does provide flexibility through the principles we've laid out for the development of the counting methodology that would qualify for a RAIN exemption. There's been a lot of focus on the ELCC methodology. We provided that as an example of a well-known methodology that meets our proposed principles, but we are open to other methodologies as well. And we will evaluate, and again, as I mentioned, in collaboration with LRAs, which would include the CPUC, what comes out of the CPUC's RA proceeding to determine whether any new county methodologies that come out of that would qualify for the RAIN exemption. And next slide. So with that, we recommend that the board approve our proposal to provide a RAIN exemption option for variable demand response resources. We believe this provides for a more accurate accounting of capacity contribution of those variable demand response resources, and it also recognizes the variable nature of those resources by providing an exemption from the resource adequacy availability incentive mechanism. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Greg. Any questions from the board for Greg Cook? Okay, seeing none at this time, DMM comments, Mr. Ryan Kurlinski.
Yes, hi. Thanks again, Chair Galitova and Board of Governors. This is Ryan Kurlinski from the Department of Market Monitoring. DMM supports the ISO's proposal to exempt from the RAIN availability penalty those variable demand response resources that choose an ELCC type capacity counting method. Variable resources whose capacity gets discounted up front via an ELCC type method should be exempt from the RAIN availability penalty. So the proposal is valuable for helping to make ELCC counting methods a new option for counting variable demand response capacity, a new option in addition to the existing load impact protocols. Let's see, we have heard some concerns that ELCC counting methods could create new incentives for demand response resources to not accurately bid their true availability each hour. Incentives do already exist today for demand response. It's modeled as supply. It's not bid as true availability. So this is something DMM already monitors for as best we can. We appreciate the clarity with which this proposal requires resources that choose the ELCC option to accurately bid the quantity of capacity that is available each hour. This clarity should help make demand response more reliable operationally and should also help to expedite any action that could be taken if any entities appear to not be bidding accurate quantities. But to help reduce any new incentives for inaccurate bidding, and we also encourage local regulatory authorities to incorporate performance and variable load levels into ELCC methods and to not just rely on bidding quantities. So in conclusion, we support the proposal, and I'd be happy to try to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Any questions for Ryan?
I have a quick one. Ryan, do you foresee any difficulty in actually implementing the ELCC methodology, given that demand response is different from space-hold?
There might be some difficulty. I think there's a working group that's just starting up next week to work through the details of that. So but there's a lot of smart people working on it. So I think I hope it'll come up to we'll get a good method.
Luckily, there's no shortage of smart people at the ISO. Okay. Any other questions? Moving on to public comment.
Just as a reminder, you may enter the queue by using the WebEx raise hand icon or dialing #2 on your phone. Please make sure to state your name and affiliation before continuing with your remarks. No one has raised their hand at this time.
All right, I believe we're ready for a motion.
Thank you, Chair Galitova. Move that the ISO Board of Governors approves the tariff revisions necessary to recognize variable output demand response valued under an effective load carrying capability or similar methodology and provided them with the option to be exempted from RAIN, RAAIM, as described in the memorandum dated July 7, 2021. And move that the ISO Governors authorizes management to make all necessary and appropriate filings with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to implement the proposal, including any filings that implement the overarching initiative policy but contain discrete revisions to incorporate Commission guidance and any initial ruling on the proposed tariff amendments. So moved.
Roger, this is Stace. Hang on, there's someone that has their hands raised. We're seeing in the queue. Operator, could you please queue that up first? Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, good morning. My name is Greg Wickler. I'm the Executive Director of the California Efficiency and Demand Management Council, and thank you for recognizing my hand raising. Appreciate the opportunity to address the Board of Governors regarding CAISO's RAIM exemption option for demand response resources stakeholder initiative. First, I'd like to thank staff for moving this initiative forward as quickly as they have. This is a key element in implementing the CPUC's decision 2106-029 that authorized the treatment of DR as a variable resource and therefore exempt from RAIM. The proposed tariff language specifies that DR resource for qualifying for exemption from RAIM is its qualifying capacity value must be established through an ELCC methodology that addresses the contribution of demand response resources to reliability across all periods of the year, as well as the saturation effects of adding more of the same resources. The tariff language also specifies the key principles that must be reflected in the ELCC methodology, and that methodology must be acceptable to both the CAISO and the relevant local regulatory authority. The Council has three major concerns with the proposed tariff language. First is that it seeks to dictate the specific type of methodology used to determine the capacity value of demand response resources as a precondition for RAIM exemption. The second is that it violates the CAISO's own tariff with regard to the CAISO's role in determining a resource capacity value. And thirdly is the CAISO's continued insistence on using an ELCC methodology that has not been proven to effectively reflect the reliability value of demand response. By specifying that an ELCC methodology and only an ELCC methodology qualifies demand response for RAIM exemption, the proposed tariff language allows no room for any other methodology to be used. This could inappropriately influence the upcoming working group process adopted by the CPUC in June that will lead to that will be led by the California Energy Commission to develop a new demand response qualifying capacity methodology. It bears noting that in the same decision, the CPUC explicitly stated that using an ELCC methodology was not a precondition for DR resources to qualify for a RAIM exemption. Therefore, the CAISO's proposed tariff language is in direct conflict with the CPUC because it would predetermine the methodology developed through the CEC-led process and would violate the CPUC directive that an ELCC methodology is not required. If this proposed tariff language is approved, the Council can foresee the CAISO leveraging this in the CEC-led process to force parties and the CEC to adopt an ELCC methodology on the basis that the CAISO's hands are tied by their tariff. This is how the CEC-led process is meant to work. Instead, it is meant to consider different types of DRQC methodologies, including ELCC, but CAISO's tariff language would prevent this. Our second primary concern is in the tariff requirement is that both the CAISO and relevant local regulatory authority must agree on a DRQC methodology to qualify for RAIM exemption. This is contrary to the CAISO's own tariff, which places QC evaluation solely under the LRA's jurisdiction. CAISO tariff section 40.4.1 states, quote, the CAISO shall use the criteria provided by the CPUC or local regulatory authority to determine and verify, if necessary, the qualifying capacity of all resource adequacy resources. The proposed tariff language would create a conflict within the CAISO's own tariff. And finally, I'd like to express our deep concern with the CAISO's insistence on using an ELCC methodology to determine the the capacity value of demand response. CAISO staff often portrays it as an industry standard methodology. This may be the case for other types of resources throughout the country, but this is not the case for demand response. And to be clear, the Council is not opposed to a demand response ELCC methodology in principle, but the fact remains that it is unproven at this point. One only needs to look at the written stakeholder comments following the June 24th CAISO workshop in which E3 presented its refreshed ELCC analysis of IOUDR programs. In it, stakeholders widely questioned the accuracy of the analysis and expressed strong concerns about its lack of transparency. In the Council's view, it is entirely premature for the CAISO to be locking in a DR ELCC methodology in its tariff when its accuracy and viability are not yet proven. So in summary, the Council requests that the CAISO revise its tariff language in two ways. First, eliminate the specific reference to an ELCC methodology and any required principles, and second, align it with the existing CAISO tariff and eliminate the CAISO's proposed role in determining the acceptability of a demand response qualifying capacity methodology to qualify for RAME exemption. Thanks once again for this opportunity to provide this oral statement. I'm happy to answer any questions the board may have.
Thank you very much. Any questions from the board?
I'd actually like Greg to respond to that.
Yes, absolutely. Greg?
Yeah, yes, thank you. I just want to, clarify a couple of things. We are not by any means dictating an ELCC methodology. It's clearly, as I explained earlier, we do provide the ELCC as an example of one methodology we think could be used and would accurately account for the principles that we laid out in the proposal. That being said, we've said that we're open to either ELCC or a similar methodology that is able to adhere to the principles that were laid out in the proposal. Secondly, the contention, the notion that we're violating our tariff and determining the capacity value, we're not by any means determining capacity values here. All we're simply doing is making an assessment as to whether or not the way that the capacity value was determined for these resources, whether that should qualify for a RAME exemption or not. And this is, we did something similar, I believe about a year and a half ago for hydro resources. We had, a similar issue where we had hydro resources that had storage but weren't always able to meet their full output because of the changing hydro conditions. So, in a similar fashion, we said if they were to adopt a counting methodology that would reflect the current hydro conditions, then we think that would warrant an exemption from the resource adequacy availability incentive mechanism. So this is, the same type, and that was something that was approved by FERC and is currently in our tariff. And that we're proposing the same type of approach here. So, clearly this proposal does allow room for other methodologies to be considered and used. And again, we did accommodate, a lot of the concerns that were raised by stakeholders that we agreed that we would do this in collaboration with the LRAs as we go forward. So just wanted to make those points.
Greg, this is Greg. Just to clarify, the tariff language is very clearly stating that ELCC methodology shall be used. Or what you're saying is that you will modify the tariff language to be reflecting more flexibility in methodology?
Yeah, I believe it says the ELCC or similar methodology.
Can I ask a question here of Greg Wickler? Greg, so I think you understand this, but I guess I want to raise this again, and I've raised this at past meetings. We are a board. We are not a full-time board. We are open to meeting with stakeholders. I am very open. And so I'm just concerned or puzzled when people come to the board meeting and raise these sorts of issues, and given the time frame of the meetings, that expect them, maybe you don't expect it to change anything, but I think that a more appropriate or at least effective way to address this would be to reach out to board members, which you have every right and ability to do in advance of meetings, and to have this discussion with us. We can then go to Greg and say, here's what they say, or maybe even have Greg also participate, and hash this out. The problem that comes up when people file letters the night before a meeting, or people come to the meetings and make public comments, which, you know, certainly you're welcome to do, but if you're actually trying to influence the board, I will just tell you that it puts us in a position that I don't see how we can be responsive. We're not going to be able to hash out, for instance, this legal issue of what's in the tariff in real time during a board meeting. And so I think it would just be more effective to do this in advance and not expect, and maybe don't expect any change. But if you do, this isn't the way to do it.
Well, I appreciate that, Governor Bornstein, and we have submitted comments to staff, but we really appreciate your offer to meet with stakeholders offline, and we'll take that going forward. Appreciate your input and concern.
Right.
And of course, this is not in lieu of active participation in the very inclusive, transparent ISO stakeholder process. That is meant to be a place where all concerns are raised and addressed. And if that's not a mechanism that's proving adequate, then of course you can always reach out and take the next step. But
yeah,
this
absolutely.
is a process.
Yeah.
Right? This is a process that is very engaging, and this is also a mechanism that allows other methodologies and is open for adjustment as everything else with the ISO, and fine-tuning as the process unveils to ensure that it doesn't adversely affect any parties and is successful. So there's going to be opportunities for changes along the way, right, Greg?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to say a word on that too, because there is this, there's a timing issue, right? Because we're adopting this conditional on some sort of qualifying capacity calculation for DR, and yet we don't have that methodology in place. I assume, Greg Cook, that if in fact, as the workshops progress, we need to make changes to our language in order to make it compliant with what comes out of the CEC process, we are open to that.
Yes, I mean, again, I want to stress that, you know, the policy intent here wasn't to specify that it had to be an ELCC methodology. You know, I think the policy that we're really proposing here was more relying on the principles that we laid out to ensure that, to provide guidance that we believe that those principles are important in helping to derive accounting methodology that met those principles. And if it did do that, then we would, you know, provide that RAME exemption to those resources. So, you know, it's intentionally being written so there is some flexibility in this process as, you know, these counting methodologies are developed going forward, but it does provide, again, some guidance as to, you know, what we believe from a reliability perspective we need from those counting methodologies.
Right. I just wanted to be on the record that that is our position, that we are not taking an inflexible position regarding how we're going to calculate qualifying capacity. But that is my understanding of what your proposal was. I just wanted to make sure we're
That's correct.
Right.
Yeah,
it is
okay.
flexible, and there is precedent, as Greg pointed out, with the hydro resources that we treated previously. So there is that flexibility built in, and we also have a precedent where we've used this mechanism or a similar one before based on principle. I also believe that Elliot Bainzer wants to say something at this point.
Oh, thank you, Chair Galifa. I just want to do a quick sound check. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Well, first of all, Chair Galifa, I wanted just to, I guess I want to thank you for, you know, just endorsing and just reflecting the fact that, you know, we're really working hard through our stakeholder processes to reflect comments, and certainly letters coming in earlier is good, and you know, folks want to reach out to our board members. That's great. But at the end of the day, we are, you know, really committed to listening, and I wanted to, you know, I want to honor Greg's concerns. You know, we've heard him, and we're going to continue to communicate. I think for me, this conversation is always really important to establish two things. First of all,
that CAISO is very motivated and very interested in making sure that demand response really thrives in California. We see it as being absolutely essential. But something that's also been made unequivocally clear to me, and I think my team, especially since I arrived, is we have to try to be as rigorous as we possibly can about the way that we establish the capacity contributions of all resources, not just demand response. And we are in a transitional period, and we recognize there's more learning to do. We absolutely are committed to working with the PUC and the other local regulatory authorities to get this right. But I think there is widespread appreciation in many sectors that what we've been doing in the past is not getting us the results we need if we want to really unleash the capability of these resources and make sure that our dispatchers know what they're dealing with in terms of system reliability. So we're absolutely committed to continue working together through our stakeholder processes and partnering with Greg and others. But this is a transitional stage, and we also do need to be, disciplined in how we administer our tariffs. So I just want to offer those comments, and we'll continue to focus and work as hard as we can to try to get this to an amicable place. But we think this is an important step forward. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. DER is important, as you pointed out, and we are very dedicated to unleashing the capabilities and, of course, monetizing the assets for our customers as well. So we'll work together as we move along during this transition period. Any other questions, comments? Roger, I think we are finally ready for that resolution.
Well, as much as I know you want to hear me read it again, I will not read it again, but I will seek a motion. So who moved? Angelina, and second?
Second.
Thank you, Ash. And I will take your votes. Governor Bogwat.
Aye.
Governor Borenstein.
Aye.
Governor Galitova.
Aye.
Governor Leslie.
Aye.
Governor Shorey.
Aye.
Excellent. Thank you, governors. I think we can take that 5-minute break you promised an hour ago.
Yes, I will make it a 7-minute break and reconvene again at 10:55.
Excellent. Thank you.
Very good. Okay, I believe the board members are back.
Okay, if we are ready, I can go ahead and just do a quick roll.
Wait a second, do you see Jan?
I don't.
She was just here. Okay. Yes, there she is. Okay.
There she is.
We're all ready.
Okay, great. Let me just do a quick roll call for the record. Chair Galitova?
Present.
Vice Chair Bhagwat?
Present.
Governor Borenstein?
Present.
Governor Leslie?
Present.
And Governor Shorey?
Here.
Excellent. Thank you. We're ready to continue.
Well, great. Thank you. That was good to have a break for 5 minutes, and we will build them into the agenda for next meetings to maybe not officially note it on the agenda, but kind of decide in a time frame and play it by ear as we move through the items, because they're not necessarily set in stone. Some may go longer, some may finish pretty fast. Okay. So we're on to item number 10, decision on reliability muster and designation for Agnews Power Plant. Neil Miller and Jeff Billington.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair, Board of Governors. Today I will be asking Jeff Billington, it's Neil here, to walk through a decision we're seeking approval of for a reliability must-run designation for the Agnews Power Plant. Unlike some of our more recent appearances on this topic, this is back to a more conventional requirement looking at a local area need, which does raise some unique issues because of the current supply concerns at a system level as well. This request also does put a finer point on the importance of our local area load forecasting, as it is responding to a shift in load forecasting that has occurred quite abruptly as conditions have changed. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff to walk through the presentation, and we'll look forward to questions after. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks, Neil. And Chair Galitova and members of the board. As indicated, I'll be presenting the decision item on the reliability must-run designation for the power plant for November and December 2021 and for 2022. Next slide. The Agnew Power Plant has a total capacity of about 29 megawatts. The owner, OLS Energy Agnew, provided retirement mothball notice requesting to retire the generator as of November 1st, 2021. As Neil indicated, the request was denied as the resource was found to be required to meet the local capacity requirements in the San Jose sub-area of the Bay Area local area. And again, as Neil indicated, the load growth in that area has been significant in the recent IPER forecasts. And if the resources secure resource adequacy contracts in the meantime, the RMR contract will not be executed. Next slide, please. The ISO posted the Agnew Power Plant retirement request on the announced retirement and mothball list on the ISO webpage in November of 2020. The ISO presented the two stakeholders the need in the local capacity technical studies with the draft 2022 and 2026 local capacity study results that were presented on March 11th, and the final 2022 and 2026 local capacity results presented on April 7th. The results were then included in the final 2022 local capacity technical report filed in the California Public Utilities Commission resource adequacy proceeding. And in addition, the ISO presented on May 18th, 2021 on a stakeholder call the potential for reliability must-run designation for the Agnew Power Plant. Next slide, please. Several stakeholders have suggested that the resource should be designated as a system need first instead of as a local need, given the current system-wide resource concerns, and this would shift the cost responsibility from the local transmission access to the overall system.
The ISO does not agree with this approach given the structure of the ISO tariff and that eliminating the local needs eventually requires transmission upgrades. While this is the first time that we're going through this with the system and local need, and as system reliability must-run designations are relatively new, the ISO would be open to reviewing this in a future stakeholder process. Next slide. And so with this, the ISO management recommends designation of the reliability must-run service to establish the must-run contracts for November and December of 2021 and for 2022 based on the local capacity requirements for the Agnew power plant. And then management, we will report back the results of the reliability must-run contracts at the next board meeting. So that concludes, and as Neil said, it's for the local and similar to what we previously for RMR designations based upon the local needs.
Great, thank you very much. Any questions for Mr. Billington?
Yeah, I have a couple. One is, what kind of a plant is this? I mean, it seems like a really small plant. And second, what is our plan for getting, eliminating the local need for this plant, given that we surely expect load growth in San Jose to continue?
It is a gas plant in the area in there. And that is one of the things with the IPER forecast this year, there has been a significant with data center growth in the San Jose area. And so that's something, the alternatives to address with that load growth will be addressing in the transmission planning process that's currently underway.
Can I ask you a question? You indicate here that the RMR contract will not need to be executed if the resource secures a RA contract in the meantime. Can you just clarify what you mean by that?
Yes, if the resource, the resource, when it's looking to retire or beyond that time period, doesn't have a resource adequacy contract, if it was to secure a resource adequacy contract beyond what the date that they were looking to retire, we wouldn't be executing the RMR contract for this resource because it would be under an RMR or a resource adequacy contract.
And it's Neil here. If I could just add to that, between now and subject to the Board of Governors approving the designation, we would then be starting the negotiations around the RMR arrangements. But in the meantime, other load-serving entities may choose to pick up the resource through a resource adequacy contract, in which case we would not need to move forward with the RMR. And that's always our preference, is to not have to go through the RMR process.
Can I ask a question? This sort of, I've been trying to wrap my head around the stakeholder issue raised about system-wide benefits versus local benefits, and my impression is that, well, this plant will provide some system-wide benefits as well.
Yes.
And trying to think about how to do cost allocation in that setting. And is there a reason that this has to be done crisply or entirely in one way or the other? Is there an argument that when we are in these situations where an RMR plant is providing both benefits, that one might allocate some to each, or
so? It's Neil here. As you pointed out, a case can be made. I would just like to spend a minute just explaining the current thought process, but as Jeff indicated, we are open to reviewing the overall situation. But the history of the RMR designations for local requirements tended to be issues that were triggered by specific needs It took some time to address those requirements through either transmission projects that were coming on or needed to be planned and then implemented. So quite a few of our projects have been, the local RMR requirements have been relatively short-term and driven by offsetting transmission developments. So our stated approach to this issue for a number of years has been that we would always take care of the local needs first and recognize that a product providing a local need may also be providing a system need. And if the system need then dominated even after the local issue was taken care of, the resource would transition. Now, these don't always start and stop at the same time. So we do have, I believe, currently 3 generators that are already providing local service and were designated local RMR units before we started running into our current supply concerns at a system level. So this approach of taking care of the local needs first and then layering on additional system needs above it has been our stated approach in the past. It only recently stopped being theoretical and became actual once we started issuing our first system requirements.
Right.
So we believe that and we certainly agree the tariff structure on this could be clearer, but we do believe that what we're doing is consistent with the overall framework set out in the tariff. And it also provided the logical cost signal to the local area to address that local transmission issue. Having cost responsibility shifting back and forth from the local issue to a system level and then perhaps back sends somewhat a confusing price signal when we're also trying to encourage getting the transmission reinforcement in place. So that's been the
sort
approach.
of 2 different issues. One's an equity issue of who should pay for this, and the other is a sort of efficient price signal issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess because I've always thought of RMR as a local benefit, and I think most people have, and we are in a somewhat new world here, I'm trying to think about when it is actually creating plausibly significant system benefits as well, what the right way to think about it is. I see your point that the sort of use of RMR is as a local reliability issue is primary.
And perhaps I could also be a bit more blunt about one thing. We do see that the local RMR designations we've been relying on over the last number of years tend to follow a pretty typical pattern of addressing some unexpected occurrence. We're dependent on the local RMR for perhaps 2 to 3 to 4 years. Some backfill transmission project or upgrade gets completed, and the RMR designation is relaxed. And that's actually, we think, a pretty effective use of the local RMR designation. Longer term, we believe we ever should be in a system RMR designation. Those are very unusual circumstances that we see being layered on top and are not the way we see doing business into the future. So this is created by the current unusual circumstances, and we would hope to see ourselves not in this discussion actually going forward, that we get out of ever needing system RMR designations.
Neil, I'm really happy to hear you say that, because that was going to be my follow-up question about long-term. Like it feels like we're patching our way through, so to speak, right? But you're making the point that it follows a pattern, and that you're in front of it. You know what you need to put there as a more long-term solution.
Yeah, yes, and on the system side, like I said, that's not a situation we see as being ever a normal course of business. That's an extreme situation for us to be issuing system RMR designations. Local RMR designations, I think, will, short-term some of these are even driven by something as innocuous as a transmission project, its schedule being impacted perhaps by a regulatory issue for a year that, we don't get the in-service date exactly right, and we need to extend an RMR designation to cover the gap. So there is a more normal course of business atmosphere around local designations, whereas the system are clearly more of an exception. Now, we are, as I mentioned, when we were stating this as a hypothetical, it was one thing. Now that this has actually happened, where we have local and system designations occurring simultaneously, we're certainly up for revisiting that conversation with industry through a stakeholder process. So I hope that helps. And we tried to, what I was trying to do is frame, sorry.
I was just going to say, Neil, then what you're essentially saying is you do try to anticipate through a stakeholder process and model what load growth will look like that correlates with industry's needs. So there's less surprises.
Well, when it comes to the system requirements, we have been participating heavily and extensively in CPUC proceedings about supply adequacy issues. So that's on one side. On the local issues, through our transmission planning process, stakeholders are generally well aware of the emerging situation. Our local capacity studies not only look a year ahead, but also do a 5-year projection. And every second year, we perform a 10-year projection of future local capacity requirements. So, I think it's telling that the forecast in this area took an abrupt upward shift, and it exceeded what the transmission planning had been looking to accomplish. And our reference for this is the standard product local technical study. So this specific situation is fairly grounded here. All I was trying to really get at before with my kind of lengthy explanation was what we're proposing to do is what we believe historically has been the logical approach of local versus system. And we believe it fits within the 4 corners of our current tariff. But we are up for having a stakeholder discussion about it now that it's become an actuality as opposed to a hypothetical situation.
Okay, thank you so much, Neil. Any other questions? Okay, moving on to public comment on this item. Do we have anyone in the queue?
We have someone in the queue already, but just as a reminder, you may press the WebEx raise hand icon or dial #2 on your phone, and please state your name and affiliation.
Good morning, it's Mark Smith with Calpine. Can you all hear me?
Yes, Mark.
Yes, very good. Very good. Good morning. It's nice to see you all. I look forward to seeing you all in person again one day, someday. And Governor Shorey, congratulations on your appointment. I haven't had the opportunity to do that, even though it's much belated. I thought that as the owner of OLS Ag News, I could give you a little bit of color and maybe a little inside baseball on what's happening. Governor Bhagwat, this is a 1-on-1 combined cycle plant. We call it affectionately Little Ag News. It was built to support the Ag News State Hospital in the 80s. At this point, it's a 40-year-old project that has exceeded its economic life. It has an expired PPA where we were able to sign RA contracts to keep it available to the ISO through this summer. But the OEM no longer supports the equipment. Every time something breaks, it's a redesign and remanufacture of the equipment. It takes a ton of care and feeding. It's an expensive plant to maintain. As such, our intention has always been to retire this plant. As a matter of fact, we have a redevelopment plan that's well developed and in place for this plant. We are in the interconnection queue. We have negotiated a large generator interconnection to replace it with 28 megawatts of battery storage. We were very excited about the first mover advantage that we enjoyed and the locational advantage that this site enjoyed. The main purpose in me discussing this is that I think it's important for the board to know that this RMR designation disrupts all of that redevelopment plan. And this probably will be the case for other cogens that roll off as well. That in fact, the LCR studies that Neil just referenced indicate that as far as 2026, this little pocket, this sub-area, will continue to be capacity deficient. So it seems quite likely, almost a given, that this designation that you are making will last 4 or 5 years into the future. As such, that unfortunately curses what we thought was a first mover advantage and probably dooms the redevelopment plan in its entirety as other participants move in and fill the battery need in that local area and saturate it with 4-hour battery storage, for instance. All of this said, and hopefully that was helpful color, we are doing everything we can, Governor Leslie, to try to sell this to anybody who's willing to buy. As I've indicated, its care and feeding is expensive, and as such, we still have a lot of lines in the water, but we haven't had any nibbles yet. We have begun already discussions with the ISO on the guardrails and conditions of a reliability must-run agreement. And of course, upon your designation, should you move forward and do so this morning, we're prepared to begin to share cost data with them. We've struck what I think is a productive tone with the ISO, as we have in the past, and we look forward to negotiations to move forward. With all that said, it is our disappointment that you will designate, but we fully understand the need for this resource given the conditions, the supply conditions that exist. We are disappointed that we have a lost opportunity investment, but as I said, we understand given the current conditions. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions any of you might have.
Thank you so much, Mark. This is very concerning to me specifically because we have the opportunity to replace this with cutting-edge battery technology and give you the advantage of being the first mover, and this delays the process and potentially costs you the opportunity. I just have a quick question. Do you not have enough space on site to be able to do both, start constructing the battery storage project before this unit is dismantled and mothballed? Or is it a connection issue?
No, Chair Galitova, this facility sits literally in the Cisco parking lot. There is absolutely no space to concurrently redevelop the site and demolish and destroy the existing facility. It would take, and we have talked to Neil and others at the ISO about this, but it would take at least a year for that plant to be offline before it could come back online as a storage resource. That was well into our development plan while it was still progressing.
Okay, and there's no other opportunity for physical co-location anywhere close by that could be taken advantage of? I'm just trying to see if there's any way to get the battery project up and running because it is valuable.
I appreciate the interest. We've looked into that. If we change the point of interconnection, generally we would lose our queue position, which is the first mover advantage.
Is there anything we can do about that, Neil?
Well, as Mark, it's Neil here. As Mark indicated, the site's very constrained, so moving away from the site is basically a new development at another location. The big advantage that Mark was pointing to was the physical location they have, as well as the existing interconnection. So once you move away from both of those, basically it's the first mover advantage itself dissipates. The advantage they had here is the site. This is a concern to us. We as Mark indicated, we have talked about this issue. And this is one concern that with our planning relying so heavily going forward on using storage to exactly meet and shadow the needs, and due to rate pressure, rarely getting a megawatt more than what's required according to meet our planning criteria. It doesn't give us much buffer if the load forecast shifts suddenly in an area. And that's what's happened here, where until the load forecast shift occurred, it looked like we would be able to allow this retirement and redevelopment to proceed, but we are caught here by the load forecast in the area shifting quite dramatically. Now, when we do move on transmission upgrades, that tends to give us a step change in capacity that takes us comfortably above the planning criteria for some number of years before load growth eats into that step change in capacity. But and we'll certainly be looking as quickly as we can for what we can do in this area, given the shift in forecast.
What are we thinking in terms of a time frame, though? Because as Mark pointed out, it could be 2026 before this clunker is retired, and we'd like to see that happen faster if possible.
So we will be looking at what we can do as quickly as possible within the transmission planning process, within the cycle, yes. But
I mean, this is disconcerting that we have an opportunity to upgrade to new emission-free technology, and we're forced to run an old unit that is expensive to operate and not the desired outcome. So if you can keep us posted on how quickly we can do this, and even if we can't use the same interconnect, if there is a possibility to facilitate a nearby location for co-development of batteries, that would be, I think, advantageous to all of us.
We will work with Mark to continue to explore options for this, and we will keep the board posted.
Please, thank you.
Thank you.
Mark, I just wanted to say thank you for that backup. It's actually incredibly helpful. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I would echo that as well, Mark. Thank you, and for your commitment and understanding the greater need here in the state of California and the Western region. But Neil, can I ask you a question? How many other sites do we have like this right now?
Oh.
Where we're suddenly seeing greater demand?
This, I'll ask Jeff to add in if he's aware of any, but to my own knowledge, this is one of the few areas that took this kind of step change. I believe it was data center driven that drove a sudden spike in the load forecast in the area. I don't know if we have any other local areas that have experienced this kind of step change. Jeff, are you aware of any others off the top of your head that are looking at this kind of shift?
No, this is primarily the main area, and in the IPER forecast that was adopted this year, there was a significant increase in this area for the expected load, and SVP has been, Silicon Valley Power has been bringing this up, and it was adopted into the forecast this year, driving, like you said, this significant step change in this area.
Governor, I would add. I'm sorry, it's Mark. I would add that Calpine operates two other plants that will be in a very similar position, one in Gilroy and one in King City, both of which may very well be restricted in terms of their ability to retire, either because of local or system requirements. And again, we have and have moved forward with redevelopment plans and battery storage proposals at those sites as well. So I may be once again before you in the incoming years.
Thank you, Mark, for the heads up, and it's good to know. And Neil, if we could have a board briefing in the near future, you can just do a survey of our footprint and identify any other areas like this. It would be useful for the board to know. And I would urge us to be very proactive in handling it so that we can shorten any kind of delay that impacts a development of an emission-free resource that can replace an older fossil-based, especially power plant that has outlived its useful life. Then we have to prop.
Mark, could you just tell me, you said Gilroy and where else?
King City.
Thanks.
King City Cogen and Gilroy Cogen.
Because Chair Galitova, I remember we had an RMR in Fresno, I think less than 6 months ago. Similar deal.
Yeah. So Neil, you will do a briefing for us, yes?
Yes, we will, and we will also tie in the larger issue here that this is part and parcel of the overall concerns we have with the broader resource plan for the California footprint. That we do need a trajectory around the retirement of gas-fired power plants as opposed to a purely economic approach saying that as long as they're the cheapest thing, it's assumed they'll stay, because we are concerned about an increasing dependence on an aging fleet. So this is something we've been very concerned about ourselves. So I do agree with a number of the concerns Mark raised as well. And we'll look forward to preparing a briefing for you.
Yes, thank you so much. And we appreciate everything that you said, Mark. We don't want you to be taking on too much pain and sacrifice, so we'll try to alleviate it as much as we can.
Understood. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Not at this time.
Okay, I think we're ready for a board decision.
Sorry, someone else did just raise their hand.
Okay.
Hi, this is Eric Little for the California Community Choice Association, and I apologize. I had hit pound 2 on my phone, but apparently that didn't go through. So apologize for being a bit late on this one. But nonetheless, I want to start off by making one thing clear. CalCCA represents load-serving entities throughout the state. So we represent load-serving entities who serve load in PG&E's service territory who would be allocated these costs as local. We also represent CCAs who serve load in Southern California Edison service territory who would not be impacted by a local designation. We are, however, one of the parties that said that this should be allocated more broadly. So it is an additional cost to some of the CCAs that we serve and a potentially lower cost to others. The key is that we think that the cost causation is a very important point, and I'm going to go to that. I think Dr. Borenstein rightly noted that there's kind of two things going on here. One is cost causation, and one is efficient price signal. So I'm going to address that efficient price signal first. Efficient price signal works really well if the entity paying that cost has the alternative available. More and more load is not being served by Pacific Gas and Electric, it's being served by CCAs. So while PG&E used to be able to look at it from a load standpoint and say, well, I'm either going to pay $100 for the generation or I'm going to pay $50 for the transmission, I would rather build the transmission. They're now faced with a situation where they don't pay the $100 per generation for all of their customers, they only pay it for some. And so the decision about efficient price signal is no longer there. It's very much muted in that case. I think that the transmission planning process needs to play a much, much larger role in determining where transmission should be built to alleviate those local concerns, because that price signal is no longer efficient based upon the number of load-serving entities. The second part on cost causation, I will start off by saying all local is system. If you drew the Venn diagram, it is a circle completely contained within another circle. Once the ISO RMRs that resource, they dispatch it according to cost and grid needs. It will not be dispatched just for local constraints. It will be dispatched any time that the resource is necessary to maintain reliability on the grid, meaning that it's not just some of it that is available for system. Every single megawatt is available for system, and I do agree that there is a mixture here. There is clearly a local need that can only be met by that resource. There is also a system need going on. And I think that that system need is pretty clear. Within the past couple of weeks here, the ISO has CPM'd 637 megawatts, all of it for system need. They have also RMR'd MSCC, which is Midway Sunset, and Kingsburg on the basis of system needs. Those two resources receiving an RMR were a system basis largely because they're not located in a local area. Had they been, we would be asking the same questions about them as we are now with Ag News. With Ag News, if it were not for the local need, I am willing to bet that it would have been needed for a system need, given that you still went ahead and CPM 637 megawatts, even knowing that you were recommending an RMR for this resource itself. So I do think that a stakeholder process is necessary to talk about what the hierarchy of need is and how the cost allocation needs to work. I also want to be clear, we are not objecting to the idea of entering into an RMR agreement for this resource. It is needed for reliability, that's quite clear. Not objecting to the cost allocation for this specific resource on this basis because of concerns that the ISO has about what their tariff says about this. But I do think that it needs to be contemplated further to make sure that the costs are allocated appropriately when all customers are going to benefit from this resource. And I think that we are going to have these continue to happen. So I know that the ISO has said they're willing to conduct a stakeholder process. I would like to see the board approve this RMR, but instruct the ISO to expedite a stakeholder process on that, because I don't think it's going to be long before we see another RMR of the same circumstances, and we will be back here having the same debate again. So again, I hope that you improve the RMR to maintain reliability. I do hope that we quickly have a stakeholder process to work through cost causation to make sure that we get it right. Thank you. If there's any questions for me, I can take them now.
Thank you, Eric. Those are good points, and we do want to understand what the overall impact is, and I'm sure we'll be looking forward to having a process run by the ISO, as they always do, that answers these questions, because they are important. I know these are trying times this summer, but long term we have to have a plan in place. We cannot be relying on an aging, decrepit fleet. I believe that our CEO, Elliot Mainzer, has a comment. Elliot?
I think, yes, thank you, Chair Galitva. I wanted to, first of all, just honor, I think, a lot of good comments, Mark, and all of you have raised, I think, key issues. I want to just, though, make sure that we're not sort of losing the forest for the trees here on this topic. I'll be honest, I think it was, I don't know, 24, 72 hours into my tenure as the ISO, I told my folks I would be overwhelmed with joy if we never had to do another RMR deal. Forever. RMR deals are they're a breakdown in the planning process, right? And so all the guidance and feedback that you've given to us is exactly right, and we're motivated to do our part. But this is really something that the entire state apparatus has to look at, okay? Because it invokes both power and transmission planning and long-term resource adequacy sufficiency. As long as we're living on the edge like we are right now in California, and you've got your ISO doing backstop procurement and RMR deals, you just know you're not positioned for a healthy resource adequacy margin at either the system or the local level. So it's not just going to, as you well know, I think, not going to be just an ISO process. We're going to absolutely hold our part of this for sure. And the transmission planning issue, as I discussed earlier this morning, we're accelerating and really reinvigorating. But our partners at the other regulatory authorities in California also understand the critical role that they play in working with us to get ahead of the curve so we're not in a backstop position. So I just want to make sure everybody sees the bigger picture here. Thank you.
Well, yeah, I wanted to respond to that, actually. I, as you know, 100% agree with you. I hate RMRs. Should never happen. It's a failure of planning. Having said that, I think we're going to live with them for a while. Because while we should ideally not have to, I think we're in that situation, as we all know. Do you have the resources to think about cost allocation?
Yes, I don't think cost allocation, the resources around cost allocation. There's some very thoughtful comments here today. We'll certainly take those back. I don't think that's the fundamental limiter, and I agree we may well be living with RMR deals for a while, unfortunately. But the key thing is the reinvigoration of the entire process that I think you're seeing that at the CPC. We appreciate President Batcher's sense of urgency that she's creating there, same with President Hochschild, but all of us in the planning apparatus in California need to be really doubling down and getting ahead of these problems. Local, system, power, transmission, county rules, execution, deliverability, they all together. And so your guidance to us is fabulous, but we'll take on the cost allocation issues, but the much bigger one, we got to make this problem go away.
And you have our support for working with the regulatory partners, CEC and PUC. I mean, we have no authority over them except to urge you to do everything that you can to ensure that we're all aligned and these issues are dealt with on an expedited fashion to get ahead of the curve. We cannot be having a failure in planning year after year.
Yes, absolutely agree. Thank you.
Elliot, I would also say that we want to send market signals that incentivize for, the kind of commitment Calpine wants to make. We don't want to discourage that. So that's the sensitivity I take away from the conversation today.
Yeah, no, thank you. And those are great points, and we appreciate Mark. I think Mark provided some, I think, there's a story behind every one of these resources to a certain degree, and I think it's good context. So these are fabulous points. I do want to make sure that we don't lose the bigger picture in the moment here. So thank you.
Yes, of course. Reliability is first and foremost. We want to make sure that we can operate reliably through the summer and the next year. But again, getting ahead of the curve and replacing fossil resources that have outlived their useful life with cutting-edge new emission-free technologies should be a priority for all of us, not just at the ISO, but CEC, PUC as well. Okay, any other questions, comments?
Not at this time.
Okay, so I believe we're ready for a motion, and if it can be amended to include the reference to the stakeholder process as well.
Yes, what I will do is I will amend the motion to incorporate the discussion at the meeting today. That will be reflected in the minutes. And
Thank
so,
you.
Move that the ISO Board of Governors authorizes management to designate the Agnews Power Plant Unit for reliability must-run service contingent upon execution of a reliability must-run contract with rates, terms, and conditions acceptable to management, as described in the memorandum dated July 7, 2001, and as discussed and incorporating the comments from the meeting of July 15, 2021. We have a motion.
So moved.
Osh, and second, please.
Second.
Votes. Governor Bagua, please.
Aye.
Governor Borenstein.
Aye.
Governor Galitova.
A painful aye.
Thank you. Governor Leslie.
Aye.
And Governor Short.
Aye.
Thank you, governors, and that motion has passed.
Okay, moving on to item number 11, briefing on renewables in the generator interconnection queue. Neil Miller and Robert Emmerich.
Yes, thank you. It's Neil here. I just wanted to introduce Mr. Emmerich, who's going to walk us through what is his annual briefing on the status of the generation interconnection queue. This has gotten much more attention than usual this year due to the large volume that were added in the April open window. Now, following Mr. Emmerich's presentation on the status of the queue itself, the projects that have come and gone, those that have been completed and so forth, we do have another presentation following this that is a decision item looking for some interim mitigations we're proposing to manage the current situation, getting ahead of and getting us time to engage in a broader stakeholder process later this fall. So this is a bit of a two-part act, with first Mr. Emmerich setting the stage on the current status of the queue overall, and then Mr. Ruddy will be presenting a decision item and some tariff changes we're proposing to manage the current situation. So depending on questions that people have, we may be looking at deferring some of those questions to the next item on the agenda. But with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Emmerich to walk through the status quo.
All right, thank you, Neil, and good morning, Chair Litova and board members. As Neil said, this is a presentation that we provide annually, and typically we do this following the new cluster window for new projects, and after the deadline for interconnection customer financial security postings, where we typically see the largest amount of withdrawals occur. So this kind of sets the stage for what does the queue look like in the coming year. Next slide, please. So this chart shows the renewable capacity in the queue over time since we started giving this report back in 2011. And each of these bars represents a snapshot point in time of the amount of active projects that were in the queue that were renewable at that time, showing the amount of project capacity, as well as the type of resources that were in the queue at that time that were renewable. So for July 2021, with the addition of Cluster 14, we now have over 97,000 megawatts of renewable capacity in the queue, mainly solar and wind. This is by far the greatest amount in the queue at any time and has been heavily impacted by the large Cluster 14. The July 2021 amount represents an increase of nearly 30,000 megawatts since June of last year. The change is a result of approximately 53,000 megawatts of renewable interconnection requests received in Cluster 14 and nearly 24,000 megawatts that exited the queue, mostly through projects that withdrew and projects going into commercial operation. To date, over 23,000 megawatts have gone into operation since the ISO took over the interconnection process back in 2007. 65% of that is from renewable and storage additions, and that amount does not include renewable interconnections to the distribution system. So next slide, please. So this slide shows the energy storage capacity in the queue. And with the addition of Cluster 14, we now have over 147,000 megawatts of energy storage capacity in the queue, mainly battery energy storage systems and some pump storage hydro. This is an increase of over 78,000 megawatts since June of 2020. And to date, the increasing amount of energy storage capacity in the queue has been on an exponential trend, again, heavily impacted by Cluster 14. And nearly all of the storage projects are battery energy storage systems, of which 51% are standalone projects and 49% are part of a hybrid or co-located project. Next slide, please. This slide provides additional detail of the capacity in the queue, and there are currently over 245,000 megawatts of renewable and energy storage capacity in the queue, and 37% are in various stages of study, where Cluster 12 and prior clusters have all completed their study process, and Cluster 13 will receive their Phase 2 study reports in November, completing their study process as well. 40% of that number, over 97,000 megawatts, are renewable energy projects, either in standalone or hybrid projects, and 60%, or over 147,000 megawatts, are energy storage projects, again, of which 51% are standalone and 49% are a component of a hybrid or co-located project. And then breaking the energy storage capacity out by type, we have nearly 144,000 megawatts of battery energy storage projects, nearly 4,000 megawatts of pumped storage hydro, and a small amount of gravity or rail gravity storage projects. Moving to Cluster 14, the Cluster 14 window for new interconnection requests resulted in 373 projects received, and currently the active project stands at 366 projects. Over 53,000 megawatts are in renewable capacity and over 100,000 megawatts in energy storage capacity. And next slide, please. This updated map of all projects, including conventional resources in the ISO queue, shows the location and type of project capacity seeking to interconnect to the ISO. The overlapping county pie charts in this map further demonstrates a significant competition among project developers who are seeking to interconnect and seeking contracts with load-serving entities to enable them to finance and construct their projects to move into commercial operation. Only about 5% of this capacity is needed to meet the latest CPUC order for an additional 11,500 megawatts of new resource procurement. And the pie chart for Monterey and San Luis Obispo counties, numbers 27 and 30, show the offshore wind capacity seeking to interconnect in those areas. And most of the remaining areas are predominantly solar and storage. So that concludes my presentation. Are there any questions?
Thank you very much, Bob. I just have a very quick question. Out of the 53,000 megawatts of renewables and 100,000 megawatts of storage in cluster 14, realistically, how much of that do we expect to come online? Do we expect any of these projects to drop out? What's the?
Well, with such a large cluster, but let me back up. Typically, in a normal cluster, when we have posting requirements after phase one, we typically see anywhere from 40 to 60% project withdrawal rates. And then again, after phase two reports come in and an additional national security posting is required, we typically see another 40 to 60% dropout. I would think with such a large cluster 14 that we'll see those levels, if not even greater withdrawal rates. But again, time will tell. And as Steve discusses in the next presentation, what's going on with cluster 14 could give a little bit different signals as to whether projects decide to stay or go.
It's Neil here as well. I did want to cut in because normally we see very aggressive competition through the queue, something like one project proceeding for every 7 or so that apply. Now we're facing unprecedented volumes of new applications, the level of competition, where realistically we're down to, as Bob was indicating, maybe 1 out of 10, 1 out of 15 projects applying actually fit within the resource needs of the ISO footprint. So that level of overheated competition is creating new challenges on the current processes were designed to manage some level of overheated queue, some level of excessive competition with a larger number of projects applying than what the system needed and what the transmission system would be planned for. But facing this kind of taking this totally over the top, and we'll touch on that more in Steve's presentation, does call for us to have to introduce some new measures to manage this differently, because the current processes were not designed to accommodate, as Bob said, perhaps 20 times the amount of needed generation applying for interconnection. So we have to make changes there. We have to respond to these new realities. It does seem that part of it is driven by the fact that it's simply much easier to develop and apply for interconnection for a relatively small footprint battery storage project than it has been historically for a larger footprint generation project. But for whatever the reasons, we have to make some changes to deal with this shift in our reality.
I want to follow up on that.
Sorry.
I was going to ask you this question, the question for the next presentation, but I might as well ask it now.
Sure.
Obviously, there's something going on in the incentive process that's not entirely appropriate, right? Because we're getting flooded with requests where 90% of the projects we know are never going to see the light of day. Are there changes we should be thinking about to change that incentive structure?
Well, it's Neil. I think kind of tying back to some of Elliot's earlier comments, this is there are a number of facets here. One is that we know procurement had lagged, and while those procurement activities were lagging, that certainly generated more interest in the development community. Everybody knew that there would be a big wave of procurement hitting the deck. So that certainly helped create among the investment community the enthusiasm for developing a large number of projects and being ready to jump in when procurement finally started to get initiated after having stalled for a number of years. And, that's a situation we're dealing with on the supply side and having to extend, I'll just refer back to the earlier comments about the RMR agreements. So everybody in the industry knew a big wave of procurement was coming. That encouraged a lot of the development community to be ready and to be jumping in with a number of projects. The other anecdotal information we've been told by a number of developers was that, especially, like I said, battery storage projects are easier to develop from a footprint perspective. So many took what they were referring to as a shotgun approach of developing a large number of projects in multiple areas, and then knowing that their success rate would be relatively small overall, but wanting to jump into a number of areas simultaneously. So all of that enthusiasm out there around getting in when that next big wave of procurement is launched set the stage for this. Now, we also need to make some changes, though, in how we react and respond to that new reality. And trying to follow our conventional study process in how we manage this volume of interconnection simply won't work. And we have to make some changes there, because both we and the transmission owners put a fair bit of effort into studying each of these projects, even if it's just for their physical interconnection, that is taking resources away from other activities. Right. And so that perfect storm was created, and we do have to react to it. And that's part of what we're getting into in Steve's presentation.
Yes, thank you, Neil. But let's also be careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater here. It's encouraging to see that there's such great potential for development of resources, both storage and renewables. It's a little bit solar heavy, and it's very battery storage heavy. So as we move forward in trying to fine-tune all of these projects, we see that we've got the capacity, which is fantastic. Moving through the projects in terms of studying and interconnection requirements, you're right, it's time-consuming, it's expensive, it's also expensive for the project developers. So if we can make it more efficient and optimize it across the board, that would be helpful, because we do want to see that projects are viable and they're available and there's the opportunity to develop them. We also want to see storage come online fast. We'd also like to see more diversified storage and longer-term storage. Batteries are great for the 4-hour time frame, but as we move to load shifting, load management for those longer duration requirements for storage, we need to be cognizant of that too. So it's good to see that we've also got pumped hydro in the queue, and I'm very curious about that project with the rail cars going up and down the hill carrying stones. So even though it's only 44 megawatts, it's interesting to see new technologies coming in the queue and having a potential to be a resource for us and a solution. So I think there's good news in this, that we've got the potential for so many resources to come online. Nobody can come in and say, we don't have enough space to develop solar energy in large capacity. Here's 100 megawatts waiting. We're physically constrained by transmission for it, but let's make sure that we also see the very positive side of this.
Yes, and I totally agree. And in other fronts, we are also continuing to press the need for more resources to get out of the current supply situation we're in, and also a more diverse fleet to address the total operating picture, as opposed to putting all our eggs in one basket. So we are continuing to press hard on those issues in every forum we have access to.
And we don't have to, we don't have to educate people to tell them that you can have 100, 200 megawatt solar plant online in less than a year, very quickly, combined with storage as well, where the development of other resources may take longer and be more expensive at the same time too.
I should probably shift to,
Neil,
I think it would be appropriate, oh, sorry. Yes?
Sorry, Neil, can I just ask a clarifying question about the way this is presented? You're presenting the 196,000 plus megawatt of in-state totals for interconnection versus this 50,755 megawatts of out-of-state interconnection being sought. I just want to know why you break it up like that. And then my other question is on the demand side for these megawatts. The CPUC RA 11,500 is one goal, right? Will you clarify? These megawatts will also seek other sellers or buyers, right?
So first, we were just trying to provide the geography of where the resources were to help people understand the location. So we just found that that was helpful information. To the extent they're connecting directly to the ISO grid, the state they're in doesn't matter. The ISO grid does extend beyond the California boundary, especially with the Grid Lines Valley Electric Service Territory, as well as extensions, radial extensions of the ISO footprint out of state as well. So that was just an attempt to clarify where these resources are applying. Now, I'm sorry, and the other part of the question, I just lost my train of thought there.
You were indicating that your ratio is changing because the demand versus the supply is so different. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I should mention that the CPUC has an before the 11,500 that was megawatts of authorization that was directed by the PUC in June. There already was an earlier authorization for 3,300 megawatts of procurement to come online from 2021 through 2023. Some load-serving entities also are looking for resources that they see they're going to need, whether it was authorized or not. But the bulk of the procurement was only going to occur once there was an authorization. So we have to be, realistic about that. That until that authorization was approved, it was unlikely that there would be any material amount of procurement activity. So that really did hit the sounding gun for the next wave of development. In the authorization, in the decision authorizing the 11,500 megawatt procurement, the CPUC also indicated that that was the mid-term procurement focusing on 2025-2026 needs. And there is an expectation that additional authorizations will be coming out at or around year end as the CPUC's integrated resource planning process wraps up on the next wave of 2030, 2031 requirements. So we are expecting more authorizations at or around year end as well. So we're going to be very busy in the generation development and interconnection business over the next stretch.
Neil, this is Jan. I'm sorry because you may have already answered this. My audio has been cutting in and out on me, so if you did, I apologize. I noticed that your chart showed almost 4,000 megawatts of pumped storage. Where is it? And I was surprised to see that much, so I was just curious about what are people proposing, or is this relicensing of existing facilities?
No, these are new facilities. They are in our queue. Bob, did you have the list handy of the specific pump storage projects?
Those are new to Cluster 14, and I'm not quite as familiar with those. I'd have to take a look and determine where those are actually located at.
Okay, I just was curious if they are all very small additions to existing facilities or if somebody really is proposing a big new pump storage plant.
Oh, no, we have had large pump storage facility projects proposed in the past and would often reappear. So we'll get you the names of the specific projects.
Neil, yes. I'd like to see that too, whether we have San Vicente or the Eagle Crest or any other project that we've seen pop up time and again.
Yes.
Okay.
Generally, these are projects you've seen before that have cycled through and come back, but we'll get you the accurate list. So the only other thing I should say before transitioning to Steve Reddy's presentation on the Cluster 14 was that the resource development industry was very supportive when we were communicating what was happening in Cluster 14. The resource industry has been very supportive in recognizing the dilemma that this caused and have been very supportive of working with us on both interim and want to move forward on longer term solutions. So they recognized very clearly as well, there was broad recognition that what was showing up in cluster 14 was going to have to trigger some changes. So I just wanted to mention that up front, that we've really been pleased with and counting on their support. So with that, perhaps I could change to the next agenda item. So Steve Ruddy is going to, our Director of Grid Assets, is going to walk through a presentation on some interconnection process changes we're looking at to deal with the current situation in cluster 14, that would then feed into a broader stakeholder process we intend to launch in September. Steve, if you're available.
Yep, thanks, Neil. And I guess it's now good afternoon, Chair Galitva and governors. So as a little background, the current ISO generation interconnection process encompasses a 2-year study process that includes a phase 1 and a phase 2 study with annual reassessments. These studies identify the network upgrades needed for the customer to safely interconnect to the ISO grid, as well as provides cost estimates for these upgrades. The majority of customers only finance. They do not pay for the network upgrades by posting larger amounts of financial security as they progress through the interconnection process. Financial security is based on their network upgrade cost estimates, which include firm cost caps based on the lower of the phase 1 or the phase 2 study cost estimates. If costs ultimately exceed the caps, the transmission owners assume the cost. Upon achieving commercial operation, the transmission owner reimburses the customer for what it financed. However, if a customer withdraws from the queue after posting financial security, some of the financial security is non-refundable and is used to offset the cost of shared network upgrades still needed by other customers or offset regional or local transmission revenue requirements. So that was a little background. So if we go to the next slide, please. All right, this graph is pretty illustrative of what we're dealing with. Typically, the ISO receives about 113 interconnection requests a year. This year, we receive an average of 113 interconnection requests. This year, we received 373 requests. Next slide, please. These 373 requests totaled over 110 gigawatts of requested capacity at the point of interconnection and 151 gigawatts of combined generation capacity behind the point of interconnection. A solar battery hybrid facility would be an example where the combined generation capacity may exceed the requested interconnection capacity. So adding this, what we were fondly referring to as the supercluster, to the existing pre-cluster 14 queue projects, brings us to over 174 gigawatts of requested interconnection capacity and 245 of combined proposed generation capacity. This volume of cluster 14 significantly exceeds the capacity of the ISO and the participating transmission owners to meet the normal timelines established in the tariff and the business practice manual. For the ISO and participating transmission owners to provide meaningful study results for this many projects and the associated capacity amount under our current tariff framework, it became very apparent that we need to expand the study timelines and alter the study process. Stakeholders, as Neil said, are in general agreement with this assessment. Next slide, please. So management is proposing 3 principal revisions to its queue cluster interconnection process that will only apply to this cluster 14. The first principal revision is the overall study process will be extended by approximately 1 year with accompanying study modifications. Now, the ISO and the transmission owners did look at a number of alternatives to see if this timeline could be shortened. We looked at adding more resources. However, adding resources by the ISO or the transmission owners beyond the increases we've already made have not been found to be plausible due to the specific skill sets and experiences required, and skilled staff, most likely due to the 373 projects, are largely under contract with other parties. We explored ways to limit Cluster 14 projects. However, defining and applying more stringent application criteria to Cluster 14 projects to reduce the volume and obtaining stakeholder consensus as to what this criteria should be in this narrow initiative was not feasible either. In addition to the one-year extension, study modifications will also be required. The ISO and the transmission owners evaluated their ability to maintain all current study procedures, but doing so would have required an additional 2 years to complete the Cluster 14 interconnection studies. Management does not believe it is reasonable to postpone study results by more than what is proposed or extend the start of Cluster 15 by more than 1 year. Therefore, management proposes to modify how the ISO and the transmission owners conduct the Phase 1 studies, yet provide meaningful results. A few of these modifications include establishing reasonable study scenarios and dispatch assumptions for the steady-state thermal and voltage analysis. The total generation inside a study area will be limited to produce meaningful results. Stability assessments will not be performed in the Phase 1 since the system conditions and generation dispatch are not expected to produce any system-level stability issues that drive reliability network upgrades. Also, the short-circuit study methodology will be modified, limiting the total capacity in the evaluation to produce meaningful study results. But regardless of these changes, the Phase 1 studies will still identify direct interconnection facilities and network upgrades necessary to interconnect the generating facility, to mitigate thermal overloads and voltage violations, and address short circuit and reliability issues associated with the requested interconnection service. We will also identify the We will also identify the cost and cost allocations for all required reliability network upgrades and deliverability network upgrades for customers requesting deliverability. All right, that's the first principle. The second principle revision is that the estimated cost and cost allocations provided in the Phase 1 studies will be advisory, and the Phase 2 studies will set the cost caps. Now, this is because the proposed supercluster, again, Phase 1 interconnection study results rely on a different study process in the typical year. Management proposes that the Phase 1 results do not impact the ultimate maximum cost responsibility. Instead, the Phase 2 will set the maximum cost responsibility. The Phase 1 study results will still provide current cost responsibility used to establish the initial financial security posting requirements, which is a critical milestone to ensure only viable projects continue in the queue. But that principle leads to the third principle, and that is interconnection customers will be eligible for a 100% refund of their initial financial security if the Phase 2 study increases the maximum cost responsibility by 25% or more than identified in the Phase 1 study, or the Phase 2 study extends the longest duration reliability network upgrade by 1 year or more than identified in the Phase 1 study. This 25% threshold is a common metric used among ISO RTOs for determining refunds. FERC has approved similar provisions for SPP, MISO, and other utilities. And also, the customer must withdraw prior to the second posting to be eligible for the 100% refund. All other interconnection procedures will remain in effect for this Cluster 14. All right, now the next slide, thanks. All right, this table shows the ISO's proposed deadlines for the Cluster 14 supercluster as compared to the typical cluster deadlines. As you can see, the overall schedule has increased by approximately 1 year. For example, the Phase 2 study results would be published in November of 2023 as compared to November 2022. And the Cluster 15 window would be open in April 2023 instead of April 2022. As far as interrelated timelines, such as scoping meetings, results meetings, customer response timelines, these deadlines will also be extended appropriately. These proposed deadlines will be firm. However, the ISO may accelerate the schedule if we have a significant amount of attrition as we go through the scoping meetings and the phase 1 process. Our goal is to beat these dates. All right, next slide, please. The majority of stakeholders understand the situation and the need to adjust Cluster 14 timelines, and the study methodologies and generally support management's proposal. It was somewhat surprising at how many stakeholders proposed that the ISO apply additional or more stringent criteria to enter or continue in the study process. Suggestions included requiring site control, power purchase agreement status, only select resources types could be moved through, or other indicators of high readiness levels. Management, as well as a number of other stakeholders, were concerned about adding retroactive requirements now to Cluster 14. So the ISO does plan to further vet these proposals, as well as others, in a more extensive interconnection process enhancement initiative. IPE, I know you all are very fond of the IPE initiatives that come through later this year. All right, so in conclusion, management recommends the board approve its Cluster 14 interconnection procedures. It will allow the ISO to accommodate the Q supercluster under our current tariff framework and ensure meaningful study results. It provides interconnection customers with certainty for Cluster 14 timelines and processes, and will enable the further modifications to be considered in a more extensive interconnection process enhancement initiative to be initiated this fall. With that, go to questions.
Thank you so much, Steve. This was a great overview, and I completely agree that you shouldn't be imposing anything retroactively that does send a bad signal. And it's always a struggle between expediency and making sure that you don't have developers who are just holding up space in the queue when they really don't have a viable path forward towards executing a project. So it's hard and it's tough to run this balancing act. So congratulations to you and the team for doing it.
So thank you, Angelina. The team was great, and the stakeholders were great. I mean, we literally kicked this off in late April when we saw the numbers. And here we are in front of you in July, and that was pretty impressive. The stakeholders really came through for us, and so did our team, and so did the transmission owners. There's a lot of people to recognize, but you know who they are.
Yes, and it's an overall very positive message. I'm glad to see the enthusiasm. I don't want to dampen the enthusiasm. I just want to see the most viable projects with the best cost optimization across the board. And, of course, the highest value to the grid and everybody being a good grid citizen. I have one quick question. Are you treating the interconnection payments and the interconnection burden for a storage project, meaning more of a battery project, not the longer-term storage such as pumped hydro, the same as solar?
Yes, they all have the same payment based on their point of interconnection request.
Regardless of size and cost of the project.
Right. Well, it depends on what upgrades they require. I mean, let me step back. The study deposit for everybody is the same, $150,000. Now, they get back whatever we don't spend through the studies, obviously. Now, the financial security is based on their network upgrades that are required.
Right.
And it increases over time. So if they pick a great place and there are no network upgrades, then they have very little financial security required.
Great. And do we have maps of those locations so that people know where they are, or we haven't released them?
We post on, can't remember the name of the site, but we have a site for those that have signed a non-disclosure agreement that can go and see our base cases and do some analysis. However, I do think we need to address that further, and the IPE coming up, we will be definitely dealing with that. How do we get more information out for them to find the best place to connect, and how do we limit the number of applications so that we're studying the real projects and not wasting our money and our time? Yep.
It's Neil here. I'd also just jump in and add that in the annual transmission planning process, we also provide indications of where there's surplus capacity. Now, that in the transmission planning process, we always do that work assuming that the transmission upgrades that have already been approved by the Board of Governors, that those are completed and in doing the work to say, well, how much more can we handle in a number of these areas? The other thing we provide to the Public Utilities Commission in the course of their development of their annual portfolios is how much generation can develop in certain areas before you would trigger the next area upgrade. So that type of information is out there. And one of the suggestions we've heard is that we could do more to help package and make it more digestible for the development community. And that's something we certainly want to take a look at about how we can better inform where those opportunities are. Now, some opportunities like the long-term pump storage, though, aren't terribly portable. Those opportunities are where they are.
Right.
And that's just something we have to deal with. Batteries are probably the most flexible resource we've ever seen that can be located, and we're getting applications that are pretty much everywhere on the system,
right.
putting it bluntly.
And I was just wondering, just as a clarification, so a small 1 megawatt battery project would also have to post $150,000, just like a 4,000 megawatt pump hydro?
Well, it would, but we tend not to see projects that small apply to connect to the transmission grid.
Even if it's 20.
Small projects will apply to connect to the local distribution system through the utilities distribution access charges, as opposed to connecting. There tends to be, given the cost of a physical interconnection at high voltage, that tends to limit it to larger projects.
Well, what's the smallest size we see? I'm just wondering, it may not be very useful to see whether a distinction between a smaller project of one type warrants the same posting. Because you lose that if you drop out, and for some smaller developers, it may be a significant cost.
The study deposit that Steve referred to is refundable for the amount that's not spent studying that project. So those costs are tracked, allocated, and they are refunded. Steve, I'm thinking that most of the interconnection projects we receive are 100 megawatts plus, some down in the 50 range, and not much. There'd be the odd one down in the 20 megawatt range, but those are probably connecting to lower voltage facilities in the PG&E system that are under our control.
Yeah, I think you're correct. Yeah.
But most of the projects we receive that are applying to connect to the high voltage facilities are, I would say, 100 megawatts and higher. And this is actually, at one time, the study approach did apply a sliding scale that smaller projects didn't have to post as much of a study deposit. But I hate to say it, but studying an interconnection to study what it takes to physically interconnect a project if you're connecting to the 230 kV system, the study work that goes into designing the interconnection isn't going to be that much different based on the size of the project actually connecting. You know, you're studying a transmission line, you're studying a new bay termination inside a substation. The breakers are the same breakers, so it doesn't change that much based on the size of the actual project.
So that's why you have larger projects co-locating. Okay, this is very useful. I don't want to take up more time, but I would like a separate briefing on the details of this because it is of interest, and I'm curious to see how we're approaching it. It's going to continue this way for quite a while, and we need to make sure that we've got the best system that accommodates the maximum amount of development we could potentially absorb and utilize.
Yeah, can I jump in with one question?
Sure.
Where are we on personnel constraints on the CAISO side? Would having substantially more headcount to work on this cut this down and cut down the queue, or is that not the constraint?
It's Neil here. I'll take the first cut at that and then ask Steve to jump in. We would have been very strained trying to meet these timelines, no question about it, because this was literally 2.5 times increase in workload compared to what we'd seen even the year before, which we had thought was a big workload. Even if we'd been able to overcome our own challenges, the amount of engineering work that the utilities have to do on the interconnections totally blew through their ability to manage that. And quite frankly, we also need those people devoted to some of the project work for the projects that are being designed and under construction. So we don't want them taking everyone out of the rest of their organization to focus on Cluster 14. So there was no question for us that the utilities capability were the biggest obstacle. We might have been able to work our way around it, but we were also severely challenged.
So,
and as Steve pointed, some of the consultants we normally would have turned to were also under contract with the developers who developed and filed these applications.
Neil, this is Elliot. I'd like to, if you guys can hear me, I'd like to respond a little bit and also just, again, I think this topic, I'm going to keep this relatively brief, but again, this lends itself to sort of stepping back and thinking about the big picture. You know, this issue of superclusters and queuing is a problem across the United States. Yeah. And I think just this morning, I know that FERC is opening up, I haven't seen it, a rulemaking or notice of inquiry entitled Building for the Future Through Electric Regional Transmission Planning, Cost Out, and Generator Interconnection. So you know, Governor Bornstein, I think your question about resources is a really good question. I think that there's another question just in general. Where should we be putting our resources with respect to transmission planning? Queuing is an element of open access. We need to be responsive. But where we need to be moving here is instead of having transmission planners reacting to queues and studying hundreds and hundreds of requests, only a small fraction of which will ever get on the grid, we need to be shaping queues through more active, coordinated power and transmission planning. And that really is the direction that I've asked Neil and the team to be moving to. They are moving that direction. This involves the kind of coordination with PUC and CEC. Again, you've got the state level RA and power planning. And our job is to convey to the folks on the power resource planning where are the most efficient, cost-effective places to get resources onto the grid and shape queue requests rather than spending 4 years having to respond to them. So it's a question of allocation of resources and focus of energy. So, of course, these guys are doing a great job reacting to these 373 requests, but the whole process, honestly, needs to be reimagined, and nobody's happy with it.
So, yeah, this is Ash. I want to jump in on that because that is actually what I was about to say, which is that it is utterly predictable that Cluster 15 is going to look bigger than Cluster 14 by a lot. In addition to just trends, the fact that we're delaying opening Cluster 15 by a year completely guarantees that, right? So I really want to really sort of back up what you just said, which is we need to be thinking hard about how to shape that cluster because otherwise we're going to be drowning. And we all know there aren't that many engineers in this country, right? There's a labor shortage too. So it's not as if we can just, it's like the entire country can just triple its staff. So yeah, I really, really encourage you to think hard about that process.
Thanks. Yeah, we definitely will. And my point also is we need to be thinking about this with industry and with the commission that sets the rules around this so that we can break out of what this has really been a problem for, 20 years. And we've got to finally shake loose of it and get the resources on the grid more efficiently.
Exactly. Shaping the queue is very critical, and it has been a dysfunctional process and exacerbated by the amount of projects growing every year upon year, culminating in what we're seeing in Cluster 14. And the inefficiencies built in because it takes time to do the study, it takes time to do the upgrade and interconnection requirement studies for every single project, whether it's 20 megawatts or 200 or 2,000 megawatts. And we know that only a fraction of these are going to go forward, so a lot of studies are taking place without them technically being needed. So if we can minimize that process in some way, as we reimagine, as Elliot pointed out, the future, it would be helpful for us, for the agencies, and for the developers, and hopefully expedite the process too.
Yes, and it's Neil. I just wanted to tag on that in addition to everything Elliot said, we were thrilled with the support from the stakeholder community, the generation resource development community, about the need both to do something in the interim here to buy us time to get to that larger process, because they did recognize we have tariff obligations we have to meet in the meantime, and to get time for that larger process and some research that we have underway. So we do want to hit this hard in the fall, and we're committed to making some changes here so that we get this under control. And I'm afraid Asha's comments may have been one of the most depressing things he's ever said to me about Cluster 15. but I agree. It's still just unpleasant to hear it out loud.
Look at it on the positive side. We'll have a streamlined process, and it will all be good. But please keep us posted as you go through this intellectual exercise. It would be good for us to be informed and involved as well.
Thank you very much.
And Neil and Ellie, can I just ask a question? With this kind of supply, right? Are we seeing anything happening with the cost? Meaning as we procure more and there is more available people to provide energy, is it affecting the cost of energy?
Well, it's Neil. We don't see the prices they're offering in their negotiations for securing power purchase agreements, so that's a blind spot for us. I have to admit, though, we see so many very similar projects quoting exactly the same type of technology. I think I would be struggling to see that many of these competing projects have a big price spread between their different offers because they're so similar. There are advantages about location that will give some a competitive advantage on the transmission system as well as land use costs. But the technologies themselves tend to be very similar when we're looking at this level of oversupply.
Thanks.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, moving on to public comment.
We do have one person already on the line, but to enter the queue, please select the raise hand icon to the right of your name just above the chat panel. If you did not connect your audio through WebEx, please press #2 on your telephone keypad. You should hear a notification that your hand has been raised. And please state your name and affiliation before giving your remarks.
Hello, this is Eric Eisenman with PG&E. Can you hear me?
Yes, Eric.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Board of Governors. Thank you for this opportunity to speak on the Cluster 14. I'd like to provide some context on this matter from PG&E's perspective. So first, for reference, the PG&E system summer peak load is about 21,000 megawatts. The total number of projects that were requested in the queue to connect to PG&E is 195 projects and something like 49 gigawatts. For comparison, Cluster 13 for the PG&E area alone had 71 projects totaling about 20,000 megawatts. So I'm kind of piling on here about what's happened with Cluster 14. As you've heard, this is a tremendous challenge for the ISO and PG&E to produce meaningful and timely study results. Detailed studies for Cluster 14 will be complex due to such a large amount of new resources that will need to be evaluated and expected network upgrades required to accommodate all these resources. Without adequate time, the quality of the studies and information contained therein will be impacted. So with this background, PG&E would like to recognize the CAISO for having the foresight to take these procedural steps to accommodate this super cluster queue and ensure more meaningful study results. So with that in mind, I just want to thank Neil and Steve and Jeff Billington for their collaboration with PG&E on this. And I also want to call out my colleagues at PG&E, Seth Nagra and Marco Rios, who were responsible for transmission planning at PG&E. This is a huge lift, and thanks to all of you. So PG&E would like to express support for the 3 principal revisions that Mr. Ruddy described for this Cluster 14. With this time extension, PG&E is confident we'll be able to meet the timeline while still delivering a quality product to the interconnection customers. And I'll second what Mr. Ruddy said. If we can beat the timeline, that'll be great, and we'll certainly work with the ISO and the interconnection customers on that. I acknowledge the rest of the discussion about that the board just had and Mr. Mainzer's comments. We definitely have to look at where the best places are for resources. Appreciated the discussion about how PG&E allocates its labor resources. It's a real struggle right now, and yes, we need more electrical engineers, probably both at PG&E and at the ISO. Needless to say, the upcoming interconnection process enhancements initiative, PG&E will be active in that. We look forward to working with Neil, Steve, and the team and other stakeholders on that. So I would request your approval of this decision. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Eric. Any other comments?
Yes, we have one more person in queue.
Hi, this is Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting, again speaking for LSA and SEIA. Thank you for giving me a second opportunity to talk to you today about this particular issue. As was discussed earlier, we did participate actively in this process, and we're very supportive and understanding of the needs of the CAISO and the PTO staff to extend this process. We're encouraged to hear that, first of all, these are, at our encouragement and others' encouraged, and the CAISO accepted, that these dates that are in the process are outside dates, so that if the process can go faster and can be made to go faster, then it will. And we really were appreciative of that, and hope that will be possible. We did propose a modification to the criteria for the 100% refund of security for the first posting that we felt were justified. There was concern by some stakeholders in general, not really for these particular things, that this would make it easier for projects to stay in and that they would be less likely to drop out if that happened, and we understand that. However, we're hoping to go into the interconnection process enhancements process, and it looks like the timing of that will allow at least some of those modifications perhaps to be applied in the second part or the later parts of Cluster 14. So we hope that will we hope that will be possible, and appreciate staff's ability to or staff's allowance of our entry of those topics into that particular process. Stepping back for just a little bit on this. This cluster is going to be difficult to work through, and we do encourage the CAISO to look at other jurisdictions for more streamlined ways possibly to do this. But at the same time, if there's going to be reluctance to do anything, tighten anything or change the rules in any way for what's already existing, then once you've already got 200 gigawatts in the 245 gigawatts in the queue, and then you change the rules for anything going forward, yeah, I mean, it may help you with Cluster 15, but unless you can get some of that earlier, for lack of a better term, deadwood out of the queue, you're not going to really have the full effect of any reforms that you might want to impose. So we have encouraged the CAISO and hope they will take us up on that in the IPE to look at potential carrots. So if you can't make people leave the queue, perhaps you can encourage them to leave the queue. And one of those might be, for example, allowing full refund of any security that has been posted, so that if they leave, they don't have large forfeits of security. Part of that might be allowing them to take the deliverability awards they've gotten, because in many areas now, deliverability is a scarce commodity, and many new projects coming in did not get deliverability awards because it's already been doled out. Whatever's there has been doled out to the projects in the queue. So perhaps a project in the queue could sell its deliverability award to a later queue project on the condition that it be allowed to withdraw. So we're hoping that there'll be some creativity allowed and considered in this process, in encouraging projects that are not moving forward to get out of the way and allow some projects that are serious and can move forward to do that. So we look forward to working with the CAISO, look very much forward to participating in the ITE process, and encourage you to adopt the proposal today.
Thank you very much, Susan. Yes, we will be working very hard, I'm sure, to streamline the process and make sure that we encourage folks that are not viable participants in just holding up the queue through various mechanisms to withdraw faster and perhaps benefit a project in a later queue in the process as well, as you suggest. So I'm sure there's many ways to do this, and I'm certain that the ISO, through their processes, will be working with you as well as all stakeholders to make sure that we streamline and improve the process as much as possible in the fastest way that we can think of and implement. Thank you. Any other comments?
Not at this time.
Okay, I believe we're ready for a motion.
Great. Thank you, Chair Litva. Move that the ISO Board of Governors approves the proposed Cluster 14 interconnection procedures as described in the memorandum dated July 7, 2021, and move that the ISO Board of Governors authorizes management to make all necessary and appropriate filings with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to implement the proposal, including any filings that implement the overarching initiative policy, but contain discrete revisions to incorporate Commission guidance in any initial ruling on the proposed tariff amendment. Have a motion, please.
So moved.
Second.
Second.
Thank you. And your vote, Governor Bhagwat.
Aye.
Governor Borenstein.
Aye.
Governor Galitova.
Aye.
Governor Leslie.
Aye.
And Governor Shorey.
Aye.
Excellent. Thank you, governors. Back to you, Chair Galitova.
I'm sorry, I was on mute. The next item is a briefing on the 3-year roadmap and annual plan. Anna McKenna and Greg Cook. Hello?
Maybe they're on mute as well.
Oh, okay.
Greg?
Anna, are you there?
Yeah.
Oh, it's Greg. Okay.
I'm not sure Ben is there, but I can take this. Yeah, so we're bringing to you an update on the 2021 policy initiatives roadmap and annual plan that we presented to you at the end of last year. I will go through this relatively quickly. I know I'm standing between everyone and lunch. If we go to the next slide, please. So really focusing on, why did we change the plan? And really there were a couple of primary drivers. The main one was the market enhancements that we developed for summer 2021 readiness. And coming out of that initiative, we added 2 initiatives to the 2021 plan, and these were identified as high priority initiatives that we needed to address quickly. The first is the external load forward scheduling rights process. This is the one that Elliot talked about earlier in his CEO report, and also a new initiative on the resource sufficiency evaluation. And again, this came out of some of the analysis that we did on the 2020 heat wave and looking forward to changes that we would want to make going forward. And then also by having that initiative conducted earlier this year, that also resulting in us having to delay a number of initiatives that we had planned on working on this year until next year, and that includes the frequency response measures initiative. We had an initiative plan for VER dispatch enhancements, joint owned unit model, and a hybrid evolution initiative. And then next, we've also reprioritized elements of our resource adequacy enhancements initiative and moved this to a three-phased approach. So if we can go to the next slide. So what we're looking at here is we've broken this out into three phases, and this would be also split out by the resource adequacy year in which they would be in effect. The first one, the phase one, was really those enhancements that we could help for our summer 2021 readiness. So these are largely done and implemented now. And then phase two is focused on changes that we would need to the RA requirements to align them with our proposed changes to the day-ahead market and the day-ahead market enhancements. And those would be related to the must-offer obligations and bid assertion, as well as changes to the flexible resource adequacy product. And those we would be looking at implementing in the fall of 2022 for the 2023 RA year. And then finally, phase three, which would be some of the longer-term changes to the RA framework, would be moving to a UCAP, which unforced capacity evaluations methodology, which would replace the resource adequacy availability incentive mechanism. We think that would provide some significant benefits, and also some enhancements to our import resource adequacy rules and some additional enhancements to the planned outage process. So next slide, please. So here's the updated 2021 plan. I'll focus on some of the changes here. You can see this does show the two phases that we'd be working on this year for the RA enhancements. Also, those two new initiatives I noted, the external load forward scheduling rights process, as well as the resource efficiency evaluation. And then we pushed off starting those three initiatives at the bottom. First, EDAM, obviously, we still have a lot of focus and high priority on developing the EDAM design, but we pushed it off not only to make room for those two new initiatives, but also that we believe it will benefit from getting the policy developed in the resource efficiency evaluation, which is somewhat foundational for the development of the EDAM design, as well as the day-ahead market enhancements. Getting some more certainty as to what that's going to look like is also foundational to the EDAM design. And then finally, we're also continuing informal discussions with stakeholders in order to identify ways to kind of bridge some of the gaps that we had where we last left off the policy development. So we believe we'll be able to start that back up in the fourth quarter of this year and kind of hit the ground running on that initiative. And then next, the scarcity pricing and system market power. This is one we were talking quite a bit about earlier this year. We're now looking at not starting that until the fourth quarter. Again, we think the benefits of doing this are really twofold. One, again, it's providing us room to conduct those two new initiatives, and then it also provides us the opportunity to really analyze how the markets performed over this summer, which will help inform that policy development once we get started on that initiative later this year. And then finally, we have just recently restarted the day-ahead market enhancements initiative, and so we're still on track, hopefully, to have that completed and implemented by the fall of 2022. So if we go to the next slide, this is turning to the longer-term view. This is the three-year view of our roadmap. A couple of things I'll note on here, that external forward scheduling rights process initiative, that new one, we actually have a couple of phases that we're planning for that. The first one would be enhancements that we can put in place for next summer, so that'd be summer 2022. And then really the longer, more comprehensive enhancements that we're looking at would go in, we're estimating in the fall of 2023, then for 2024. And then I'll also note on here we have the three deferred initiatives, the frequency response measures, the VER dispatch enhancements, and that scarcity pricing system market power initiative would all be focused on next year, as well as the hybrid evolution initiative that was also pushed off from later this year until next year. And so then I can go to the last slide, please. And so just an update on the process. We're looking at we're providing this update on the roadmap and annual plan. We did provide this same briefing to the EIM governing body at their meeting on June 30th. And then just around the corner, we'll be starting on the 2022 roadmap and annual plan with part of that stakeholder process starting in Q4 of this year, with our expectations as normal that we'd be presenting this both to the EIM governing body and the Board of Governors by the end of this year. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Greg. Any questions for Greg from the board members? Not at this time, and I just want to point out if there's any questions from or public comment on the briefing.
Once again, you can press the raised hand icon in WebEx, or if you connected your audio through the phone only, please press #2 on your phone. I don't see any hands raised at this time.
Okay, great. Thank you. Then we have informational reports. Any questions or comments from the board on the informational reports?
Angelina, before we go on, can I make one comment about my earlier comment to clarify it?
Sure.
It's come to my attention that it might be misinterpreted. I commented earlier about the comments made at the board meetings that bring new information to board members or objections, and apparently that has been interpreted by some people as saying that there's no point in making comments at board meetings, which was not my intent at all. My intent was to make sure that issues get aired as thoroughly as possible. And the difficulty that board members face when an issue is raised at the time of the board meeting or in a letter that arrives the night before the board meeting, if we aren't going to be able to be responsive to that and to encourage stakeholders to, in advance, reach out to board members, as you said earlier, first to participate in the process, but if they feel the outcome of the process is not correct and expect the board to consider alternatives, to give us as much heads up as possible. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Sylvain. Very, very useful. We do appreciate the stakeholder process that the ISO runs. It's a very thorough, transparent, and inclusive process. Of course, we want people commenting at board meetings. We value those comments and inputs, and today's discussions, I believe, are an example of that. And if the exhaustive ISO processes are not yielding the results that people may see after all the hard work, of course, reaching out to us is always a possibility, and as board members, we'll try to accommodate that as well. So, yes, very open, very inclusive, and all of us are eager to see the issues resolved in the best possible way and have the most reliable, carbon-free system operating not only in the United States, but the world. And we're proud of being on the cutting edge every day. Thank you. Okay, and with that, I believe we are adjourned for today. Thanks for your participation.
Excellent. Thank you, Chair Glitzva and Governors. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Roger. Thanks, everyone.